Simulation hypothesis: it is a curious feature of human consciousness that we can stare at the world around us, seemingly solid and manifest, and wonder if all of it might be no more than a meticulously crafted illusion. The simulation hypothesis is a modern articulation of this age-old suspicion, proposing that everything we experience, physical objects, laws of nature, historical events, even our own minds, could actually be generated by an advanced computational system, akin to a cosmic-scale virtual reality. In an era increasingly shaped by digital technologies, this notion resonates with cultural anxieties and scientific curiosities alike, raising fundamental questions about the nature of existence, the reliability of perception, and the ultimate destiny of intelligent life. One of the reasons the simulation hypothesis exerts such a potent hold on our imagination is that it dovetails with a long tradition of philosophical skepticism. Thinkers have, for centuries, questioned the authenticity of sensory experience, pointing out that illusions, dreams, and misinterpretations can confound our confidence in the external world. The twist that modern technology brings is the plausibility of a computer or computational substrate capable of generating experiences indistinguishable from what we consider real life. If we already simulate weather systems, galaxies, and entire cities on our digital machines, might it be possible that a hyper-advanced civilization is simulating us? To say that this idea is radical would be an understatement, but its historical roots soften the blow. Philosophical lineages stretching from ancient Greece to Descartes in the 17th century remind us that we have long wrestled with the notion that our senses might be misleading. Descartes famously speculated about an evil demon who could be feeding him false sensations, turning the entire external world into an elaborate hoax. In the present day, that demonic role has been recast as a supercomputer or an advanced race of post-human programmers. The question remains the same. If what we perceive is systematically rigged, how could we ever be certain of the truth? Our digital age has primed us for this possibility. Even crude forms of virtual reality can fool our brains into believing we inhabit a different environment, if only momentarily. Massive multiplayer online worlds draw millions of participants, each engaging with an environment that exists purely in code. The steady progression of graphical realism and immersive interfaces points toward a time, possibly centuries away, possibly sooner, when simulated realities could become indistinguishable from physical ones. This trajectory alone gives considerable weight to the thought experiment. What if this has already happened, and we are the ones inside? A widely discussed formal argument supporting the simulation hypothesis appeared when a philosopher set out a trilemma, which in simple terms goes like this. Either advanced civilizations do not achieve the technological capacity to simulate ancestral beings, or they do achieve it but choose not to use it, or they achieve it and do use it extensively, meaning there might be countless simulated universes. If the latter is true, then the odds that we are inhabiting the one true base reality, as opposed to one of many simulations, become astronomically low. The argument does not prove we are in a simulation. It only lays out that if certain assumptions hold, we are likely in one. Yet this logic has captivated both academics and lay people, injecting a dose of existential vertigo into discussions that once seemed purely speculative. Even outside such formal reasoning, signs of cultural fascination abound. Films like The Matrix introduced mainstream audiences to the concept of living in an illusory world created by machines. Subsequent works have continued the trend, blending entertainment with philosophical provocation. While the cinematic treatment often leans on action-oriented plots, the deeper resonance stems from a shared sense that something about our reality feels precarious or incomplete. The quantum mechanical insight that unobserved phenomena remain in probabilistic states has further inflamed imaginations, leading some to wonder if this cosmic lazy rendering is akin to how video games only render a scene fully when the player is looking at it. Though many physicists argue that such parallels are more metaphorical than literal, the idea that reality might only exist in certain states when observed fits neatly with the idea of an optimized simulation that conserves processing power. It is instructive to consider the matter of computational feasibility. Critics of the simulation hypothesis often point to the sheer scale of the observable universe, billions of galaxies, each containing billions of stars, and argue that simulating such immensity in real time would exceed any conceivable computational capacity. Proponents counter that such arguments assume naive approaches. A sufficiently advanced simulator might not track every particle's location at every moment, but only render the specifics when required by an observer or measuring instrument. Background regions of space could remain in a superposition of states or in low-resolution form until some inquisitive mind probes them with a telescope. This approach mirrors procedural generation in modern games, where details pop into existence as needed. In principle, if the underlying system is advanced enough, the illusions would be complete and undetectable. Yet, for all its glimmers of plausibility, the simulation hypothesis remains on uncertain scientific footing. There is no widely accepted empirical test that could definitively confirm or deny it. Some propose searching for lattice spacing in the fabric of space or discovering anomalous features in cosmic rays that might indicate a digital substructure, but such attempts have not produced conclusive evidence. If the hypothetical simulator is adept at hiding such traces, we may never uncover them. This leads some thinkers to categorize the simulation hypothesis as a metaphysical stance akin to the existence of a deity. It could be true, but it lies outside the realm of testable science, at least with our current methods. Others hold out hope that future breakthroughs in physics might reveal the source code of reality, but this remains speculative. Despite the scientific impasse, the hypothesis carries substantial existential and ethical ramifications. If we were to discover ourselves in a simulation, what would that say about our sense of purpose and meaning? One school of thought holds that it would trivialize human endeavors, turning all our achievements and sufferings into a kind of elaborate software experiment. Another view counters that subjective experiences remain valid to us regardless of their source. If a simulated human feels love, fear, or joy, those emotions are as real to that being as anything in an unsimulated environment. In many ways, this mirrors debates about artificial intelligence. If a highly advanced AI truly feels or suffers, does it matter that it is running on silicon instead of neurons? The significance of consciousness is typically found in the experience itself, not in the substrate that generates it. It is also worth contemplating whether the simulation hypothesis might shed light on theological or spiritual perspectives. While it does not require a deity in the traditional sense, the hypothetical programmers or architects of our reality could function in a role akin to gods. They create worlds, set the laws, perhaps intervene from time to time. This resonates with certain religious or mythological narratives, even if stripped of their supernatural or mystical elements. Indeed, some see the hypothesis as a fresh spin on old ideas about the nature of illusion, recalling Eastern concepts of Maya or the allegory of Plato's cave. These convergences suggest that the line separating secular speculation from spiritual discourse can grow blurry once we question the authenticity of the physical world. In a more immediate cultural sense, the simulation hypothesis captures the zeitgeist of a digital era permeated by virtual environments and artificial intelligence. Billions of people now spend a portion of their lives in digital spaces, forming virtual relationships, engaging in commerce with virtual currencies, and pursuing virtual accomplishments that hold real social weight. The boundary between the real and the fabricated is already eroding. That we might extend this concept to the entire cosmos is a testament to how deeply computers have penetrated our collective imagination. It is not surprising, then, that discussions about living in a simulation often arise alongside debates on topics like AI safety, transhumanism, and cosmic expansions of intelligence. All revolve around the question of what we become, and what we might already be, when technology extends beyond ordinary human limits. Yet there is also the day-to-day, lived dimension to consider. Most people, upon hearing that the universe could be simulated, might initially be intrigued or unsettled, but then return to their usual routines. Bills still have to be paid, children fed, deadlines met. Even if we are in a simulation, the experience of hunger, love, pleasure, or pain remains. This pragmatic stance suggests that for many of us, the distinction between really real and simulated real is not as crucial as one might think in everyday matters. Much like ancient philosophical arguments that encouraged us to doubt the evidence of our senses, the simulation hypothesis can challenge complacency, but it does not necessarily disrupt ordinary life unless one becomes obsessed with ferreting out clues of the cosmic code. For those who do become intrigued to the point of obsession, it can morph into a worldview that inflects every aspect of existence. Strange coincidences, sudden déjà vu experiences, or unexplainable phenomena might be interpreted as glitches in the matrix. Online communities dedicated to such anomalies share stories about times when reality seemed to hiccup, from repeating patterns in daily events to lost items reappearing in unexpected places. Psychologists might label these stories as apophenia or confirmation bias, pointing out that humans are naturally adept at finding patterns or attributing meaning to randomness. Yet, for someone steeped in simulation thinking, each such occurrence becomes potential evidence that the cosmic software is fraying at the edges. A related line of thought concerns nested simulations. If it is possible to simulate entire realities that spawn conscious agents, what is to prevent those agents from, in turn, creating their own simulations, thus stacking layers of artificial universes on top of each other ad infinitum? In such a scenario, it might become virtually impossible to locate an ultimate base reality, because everything might be a simulation inside another simulation. Some find this infinite regress so disorienting that they prefer to posit a fundamental layer of existence, even if we cannot detect it, from which all simulations emanate. Nonetheless, the possibility of multiple tiers remains an intriguing, if dizzying, proposition. It underscores how the simplest assumptions about universe can unravel once the idea of simulation is taken to its logical extremes. One of the more profound implications surfaces when we ponder the nature of time in a simulated framework. To us, time appears to flow in one direction. We are born, we live, we die, and we cannot revisit the past or see the future directly. Yet, from the perspective of the hypothetical simulators, time could be entirely malleable. They might pause, rewind, or fast-forward the simulation. This suggests a range of mind-bending scenarios. An entire human civilization might be restored from a save point, multiple alternative futures might be spun out from the same historical moment, or the simulation could be advanced far into the future, then reversed for further data collection. None of the simulated beings would necessarily suspect a thing if the reversal was carried out perfectly, because they would lose all memory of the timeline that got erased. If these manipulations occur, the actual lived experiences of countless conscious entities might be ephemeral from the simulator's viewpoint, while being absolutely real and tragic or joyous from the internal viewpoint of the simulated minds. This consideration touches on questions of morality and responsibility. Would an external power have the right to manipulate billions of conscious beings as though they were lab specimens, with no regard for their suffering? Are we ourselves, if we one day gain the capacity to create robust simulations of conscious life, ethically justified in doing so just to satisfy curiosity or entertainment? Some ethicists argue that if the inhabitants of a simulation truly have experiences and can suffer, then running such a simulation for frivolous reasons is tantamount to playing God in a morally reckless way. Others maintain that simulations could be a crucial tool for preventing real disasters or for studying societal evolution without endangering actual populations, thereby providing a net moral benefit. The tension between these positions underscores that the simulation hypothesis is far from an abstract intellectual game. It touches on potentially real moral dilemmas we may face if technology continues to advance. Indeed, the idea that we might ourselves become simulators is not so far-fetched if one takes a sufficiently long view of technological progress. We have already begun simulating simpler forms of life, from bacteria in digital petri dishes to entire ecological models that predict how species interactions shape ecosystems. As computational methods improve, the fidelity of these simulations increases. Extrapolate further, and one can imagine a future where we simulate digital minds or replicate the neural processes of actual people, effectively creating artificially conscious entities. If we can do it, perhaps we will, unless, of course, ethical or practical constraints intervene. Regardless of our eventual choices, The fact that it is even a serious subject of discussion highlights how the simulation hypothesis not only looks backward, wondering if we are simulated, but also forward, wondering if we will simulate others. There is also the matter of cosmic silence. The famed Fermi paradox asks, if intelligent civilizations are abundant in the galaxy, why have we not detected clear evidence of them? Could it be that advanced civilizations rapidly move from external exploration to inward simulation, preferring to create and inhabit meticulously crafted digital universes rather than physically colonize the stars? This is speculative, but it aligns with a scenario in which advanced beings redirect their resources to building vast computing infrastructures, effectively retreating from the visible cosmos. From an external vantage point, they might appear silent or non-existent, while in fact they are hyperactive within their self-made digital realms. In such a cosmos, the reason we do not see aliens might be that they are too busy coding entire new worlds to bother with the physical difficulties of traveling across interstellar distances. Another consideration arises from the notion of cosmic fine-tuning. Our universe's fundamental constants are remarkably well calibrated to allow for the emergence of stable matter, chemical complexity, and life. Some interpret this as evidence that we live in a designed universe, pointing to the uncanny coincidence that if certain constants differed slightly, galaxies and stars might never have formed, let alone carbon-based life. While the multiverse theory posits a naturalistic answer, that countless universes exist with varying constants, and we simply inhabit one that supports life, simulation proponents see in fine-tuning a strong hint of intentional design. If the cosmos is coded, the programmers might have selected these values to generate a universe that evolves complexity, culminating in conscious observers. The impetus behind that design remains unknown, but its existence could plausibly explain why our laws of nature appear so conveniently set up for life. In parallel to such cosmic speculation, there is an intensely personal dimension. People who adopt the simulation hypothesis as more than a thought exercise sometimes describe a feeling akin to spiritual awakening or existential crisis. They might interpret past mystical experiences, déjà vu, or coincidences as glimpses behind the digital veil. Others may find solace in believing that death in this realm might not be the end of consciousness if a backup or alternative version of themselves exists in the simulator's cloud. This metaphysical twist parallels religious doctrines about the afterlife, but recontextualized in computational terms. Yet none of these beliefs can be confirmed, leaving them in a gray zone between faith and speculation. For some, that is enough. For others, it remains an unsatisfying territory that fosters more questions than answers. One might suspect that serious scientists would shy away from such boundary-pushing ideas, but that has not entirely been the case. A few well-respected researchers have engaged with the simulation hypothesis, at least as a conceptual possibility. Some even propose looking for cosmic anomalies that would act as evidence of underlying code, though efforts along those lines are still quite limited. There is also a cautionary perspective within the scientific community. If one invests too heavily in the simulation narrative, it could detract from more testable lines of research. Science, after all, depends on falsifiable hypotheses, and if a posited cosmic computer can hide its tracks, how can one properly test for it? Therefore, while the hypothesis can stimulate creative thought, it often lies outside the practical domain of empirical science, rubbing shoulders instead with theology, metaphysics, and philosophical speculation. That said, many revolve around the question, so what if we are simulated? Indeed, on a day-to-day level, does it matter? The intangible nature of the question may mean that, for most people, the implications are largely psychological or philosophical rather than practical. We do not typically consult the simulation hypothesis for guidance in building bridges or treating illnesses. It might, however, influence how we prioritize certain moral or existential projects. If we suspect that advanced observers are watching how we handle crises like climate change, nuclear proliferation, or social justice, we might strive to prove ourselves worthy of continuing the simulation. This line of thinking blends existential risk with a cosmic sense of being tested or observed, reminiscent of religious frameworks that assume a deity is judging humanity's moral progress. Even with these moral considerations, the brunt of the simulation hypothesis remains conceptual. It is a lens through which to reevaluate everything from classical philosophy to quantum conundrums. It invites speculation about a future in which we, too, might become the architects of entire digital worlds replete with conscious beings, effectively becoming the gods of our own creations. It compels us to question where the boundaries of identity lie. Are we a brain in a vat, or a piece of software on some alien mainframe, or a genuine biological entity in a real physical universe? The question threatens to blur under close scrutiny, pushing us to accept that we might never know with certainty. If one approaches it in good faith, the simulation hypothesis can act like an intellectual sandbox, a place to run thought experiments about consciousness, technology, ethics, and cosmic scale, unbound by the usual constraints of conventional science. It can stimulate imaginative leaps in fields like AI, where the line between simulated and biological minds is becoming more porous by the day. It can also serve as a cautionary tale, reminding us that if we ever achieve the capability to simulate entire populations, we face ethical responsibilities on a scale never before encountered. That we can even contemplate such possibilities reveals the extraordinary trajectory of human understanding since the days of early civilizations. Still, for all the grandeur of these ideas, there remains a sense of humility. The universe, whether simulated or not, is vast, and our knowledge is partial. Each new scientific discovery, gravitational waves, new exoplanets, potential building blocks of life, unfolds a layer of marvel. Whether behind that marvel is a cosmic blueprint in the mind of advanced entities or simply the workings of natural law may be, in practice, out of reach. Yet wonder persists, fueled by the recognition that we inhabit a reality, whatever its ultimate nature, capable of conscious self-reflection, creativity, love, and the capacity to ask, is all this real? That capacity alone might be the crux of what it means to be conscious, simulated, or otherwise. It is also telling that we have begun to develop a moral grammar for our relationship with the possibility of simulation. If earlier ages sought to appease or understand the will of the gods, we now wonder if we should appease or understand the will of hypothetical simulators. Or perhaps there is no will at all, just an automated system left running long ago by beings who have since moved on. We do not know, and that unknowing can be both terrifying and liberating. It leaves us free, in a sense, to craft our own meaning, to define our own moral codes. In the end, that might be the greatest insight the simulation hypothesis provides. Meaning arises from the relationships and experiences we cultivate, not from some external stamp of cosmic authenticity. Even if we are code, we can still live authentically. That perspective resonates with the pragmatic approach found in some strains of Eastern philosophy, which assert that illusions can still have reality for those who live within them. The illusions are not the final word, but they are experientially real. So whether we label our surroundings an illusion, a simulation, or simply the physical universe, we still breathe the same air, feel the same pains, and cherish the same joys. The tapestry of our subjective lives does not unravel at the hint of an ultimate hidden truth. In fact, it might become richer when we realize just how layered the possibilities are. This is not a conclusion that resolves the question, but it is one that allows life to proceed with depth and wonder. As we approach the culminating sweep of these reflections, it might be useful to restate the major elements that have emerged. First, the simulation hypothesis challenges the bedrock assumption that the physical world is the ultimate reality. Second, it arises naturally from the interplay of philosophical skepticism, rapid technological growth, and quantum theoretical oddities. Third, it triggers substantial existential, ethical, and theological inquiries. Fourth, it invites an attitude that blends humility about our limited knowledge with awe at the scope of potential cosmic design. And finally, it underscores how intimately questions about reality's nature intersect with personal meaning and morality. These threads weave together to form a tapestry that is at once unsettling and inspiring. In the realm of everyday practicalities, the concept of a simulated universe might not guide how we fix our cars or cook our meals. Yet it might guide how we think about our place in the cosmos, how we envision the future of AI, or how we wrestle with the problem of suffering. If the entire edifice of our lives is, at root, a digital tapestry, we either accept it as the environment we must navigate with integrity, or we search for an escape or a hack that might let us break the rules. Some dream of discovering the cosmic cheat code, perhaps an arcane manipulation of quantum states or a sudden ability to see through the illusions, and ascending to the plane of the programmers. Such fantasies, reminiscent of mythic narratives about apotheosis, echo in modern science fiction. Yet perhaps the more grounded stance is that we remain ironically caged in the same fundamental ignorance we have always faced. From Plato's cave to virtual simulations, the idea is that we might never pierce the final veil. The longing to do so, though, can drive progress in every domain of inquiry, from physics to philosophy. A new theory might inadvertently reveal constraints that point to an artificial structure. A newly developed AI might crack some cosmic puzzle about consciousness. Or we might reach a plateau beyond which we cannot go, at least not with our current cognitive architecture. Even then, the quest enriches our understanding of the universe and ourselves. Because the simulation hypothesis is so capacious, touching on cosmic scale, personal identity, future technology, and ancient skepticism, it will likely remain a fixture in the cultural imagination for years to come. It stands as a testament to how quickly ideas can evolve when propelled by exponential computing power and the swirl of global media. A concept that once might have been relegated to esoteric philosophical treatises or religious allegories now animates widespread debate online, in popular culture, and in serious academic forums. From discussions of whether advanced civilizations might prefer uploading themselves to digital utopias, to questions about whether quantum randomness is an artifact of dynamic code, the simulation hypothesis offers a storyline uniting them all. In the final analysis, the scenario that we inhabit a carefully programmed environment remains, for most people, an open question, probable to some, improbable to others, and certainly unproven either way. Yet, the conversation it fosters can be its own reward. By questioning the nature of reality so fundamentally, we sharpen our philosophical tools, push the boundaries of science, and reflect on the moral weight of creation. We become more aware that our reality, simulated or otherwise, is precious, fragile, and possibly teeming with layers we have yet to discover. Perhaps that awareness, more than any concrete conclusion about code or cosmic illusions, is the real gift of the simulation hypothesis. It calls us to remain ever watchful, ever curious, and ever ready to greet the unknown with humility and wonder. The NPC theory in certain corners of the internet, as well as in some philosophical circles that flirt with metaphysical speculation, there has arisen a curious notion that many of the people around you, or possibly most, might be what we can call non-player characters, or NPCs. Borrowing language from video games, where NPCs are computer-controlled agents lacking genuine autonomy or consciousness, this NPC theory posits that in the real world, assuming it is indeed real, there are individuals who might walk, talk, perform tasks, and engage in daily life just like any human, yet lack the spark of subjective awareness that we typically identify as consciousness. They might be sophisticated automatons, scripted to react and behave but never experience anything internally. In some interpretations, these NPCs are part of a cosmic game or a computer simulation, and only a few players, or possibly a single player, have genuine subjective minds. The rest are placeholders, illusions, or lines of code that fill out the world. To some, this is a playful thought experiment, a modern spin on old philosophical issues about other minds. To others, it is a serious metaphysical hypothesis that resonates with or extends from broader claims about simulation or solipsism. Its implications for empathy, morality, and society are profound, because if the majority of people around you are truly mindless, that changes the entire moral and social landscape in which we claim to live. The basic impetus for NPC theory emerges from the problem of other minds, a long-standing question in philosophy. How can I ever be completely certain that another being experiences consciousness the way I do? By extension, how can I rule out the possibility that some or all apparent persons are merely cleverly functioning machines with no internal feeling or consciousness behind their eyes? In mainstream philosophy, the general consensus is that we cannot achieve absolute certainty about other minds. We infer consciousness in others based on similarities in behavior, physiology, and self-reports, trusting that they function like us. However, an unbroken tradition of skepticism, from René Descartes to the present day, suggests that while we feel we know other people exist, we do so primarily by analogy and social consensus, not by direct evidence of their inner experience. NPC theory seizes upon this gap, pushing it to an extreme. It suggests that perhaps some portion of the population, or even nearly all, do not have a subjective life at all. They are illusions, hollow shells, or code lines. If the entire world is a simulation, then these NPC-like creatures might literally be bits of artificial intelligence populating the environment, which might have only one or a few genuine conscious players. Those who have encountered NPC theory outside of academic circles often see it wrapped in a cloak of internet culture. Memes referencing NPCs typically portray individuals perceived as lacking independent thought, operating on predictable scripts, or regurgitating mainstream opinions without reflection. Although some of that usage is arguably rhetorical or satirical, it also touches on deeper resonances with the philosophical stance. If people appear to respond automatically or unthinkingly in certain contexts, it can stoke the suspicion that maybe they do not have a richly developed internal world. Proponents, or at least sympathizers with the NPC notion, might claim to see telltale signs of NPC-like behavior, such as repeating catchphrases or following rigid patterns in conversation. Meanwhile, critics respond that genuine consciousness can often seem routine or uncreative, and that we have no reliable metric to separate a fully conscious person from one who is allegedly a mere script. The conversation soon leads back to old debates. Is interior experience directly observable or testable? To appreciate the surprising traction of NPC theory, we should recall how common gaming and simulation metaphors have become in modern culture. As computer simulations grow more realistic, and as the concept of a matrix-like environment saturates popular media, it is no longer outlandish to propose that our entire environment, including the people within it, might be lines of code. If one goes further and posits that only some fraction of those code-based entities have conscious minds, it matches how we design video games in which the player character is real in the sense of being controlled by an actual user, while the NPCs are just AI routines. The leap from acknowledging that video games function this way to suspecting reality might function similarly is more of an imaginative jump than a logical proof. But in the age of widespread speculation about simulations, it seems like an inevitable step. If we are indeed in a grand simulation, is it not plausible that many or most of the simulated figures we interact with are akin to NPCs, lacking genuine volition or subjective consciousness? A cousin to this line of thought can be found in older philosophical territory, particularly in discussions around solipsism or philosophical zombies. A philosophical zombie, as introduced in mind-body debates, is an entity physically identical to a normal human but lacking any subjective experience. It behaves, reacts, and even speaks exactly like a conscious human. From the outside, it is indistinguishable from a genuinely conscious person. The concept of philosophical zombies was introduced to question purely physicalist accounts of consciousness. If it is logically possible for a being to have all the physical structure of a human without subjective experience, then consciousness might not reduce solely to physical processes. The NPC concept can be interpreted as a bridging of this philosophical zombie idea with modern simulation tropes. Instead of a hypothetical argument about mind and body, it transforms into an assertion that many individuals might really be zombies or NPCs populating your environment. It is no longer a hypothetical scenario but a suspicion or a lens through which to interpret daily encounters. This shift from a theoretical tool to a real possibility has serious moral and existential ramifications. Consider the notion of empathy. We typically empathize with other humans because we believe they have a conscious inner life resembling our own. If NPC theory is correct and a large fraction of them do not, then how does that shape your moral obligations towards them? If they do not truly experience pain, love, fear, or joy, do you still treat them as moral equals? Some might argue that even if there is no someone behind the facade, the illusions of social order and moral norms should be preserved for pragmatic reasons. But for a believer in NPC theory who is unscrupulous, this perspective could open the door to rationalizing all sorts of exploitation or apathy. If an entity is not truly conscious, does it matter how it is treated? Are they more akin to robots, which have no moral status beyond instrumental utility? This line of thought can become dark, reminiscent of how certain philosophical or ideological views throughout history have dehumanized groups of people by labeling them as subhuman or lacking real minds. The difference here, if NPC theory is taken literally, is that it is not about prejudice in a usual sense, but an actual metaphysical claim that such individuals are literally not conscious. Most philosophers caution that there is no reliable litmus test for consciousness beyond self-report and behavior. Even advanced neurology cannot observe subjective experience, only correlate neural patterns with reported experiences. The idea of an NPC suggests a cunningly perfect mimicry of normal behavior, so that all tests or interactions might yield normal results. In that sense, it parallels the Turing test. If an AI can pass the Turing test, one might suspect it is conscious, but it could also be a sophisticated automaton. But if your entire environment is part of a simulation, that Turing test might be stacked from the start. The code that runs the NPCs is so advanced that it fools you into treating them as conscious. The debate soon collapses into age-old skepticism. How do I even know that I am not an NPC from the vantage of some other mind? This latter question underscores that NPC theory can invert in a haunting way. Typically, one imagines oneself as the real player, suspecting that others might be mere illusions. But from an outside vantage, maybe you are the NPC. Perhaps the entire world is a game for some other being, and you are the script-driven entity who imagines having consciousness but does not. The question is symmetrical because no one has an absolute proof of their own consciousness from the vantage of an external observer. We each assume we are conscious from our own perspective if we accept that we have experiences. But we cannot rule out the possibility that even our sense of self is scripted, that we are deluded about possessing subjective awareness. In a typical scenario, we do not doubt the reality of our own mind because we experience it directly. Yet, in a scenario where illusions can be so complete, how do we know that we truly are anything more than a script that has illusions about illusions? This conundrum ties into extremely radical skepticism, verging on zero-point solipsism or illusions of illusion. The NPC question might then be a specific application of a broader lack of vantage problem. If I can suspect that others are NPCs, maybe I should suspect the same about me. Nevertheless, most expressions of NPC theory, especially the popular ones, focus on the notion that the person entertaining the hypothesis is the real consciousness, and all or most others are not. This merges with the impetus behind certain forms of elitism or spiritual exceptionalism. Perhaps a small minority are awake, and the rest are asleep or automatons. In a gaming context, it is reminiscent of how a single player experiences the storyline, while countless NPCs roam about, fulfilling roles. Indeed, for those who adopt simulation thinking, it can be quite flattering or reassuring to see oneself as among the few who are real. That might encourage a sense of cosmic specialness, a partial answer to the existential dread that arises if one suspect's life is meaningless. Maybe I am part of a cosmic or digital narrative in which I am a main character, and everyone else is a side character. Alternatively, it might also lead to alienation or loneliness. If no one else is truly real, then I am alone in a sea of illusions. To see how this idea takes hold in cultural memes, one can note the frequent references to encountering NPC-like individuals who respond with stock phrases or who cannot deviate from certain scripts. The comedic or mocking tone of calling someone an NPC in an internet argument stems from the insinuation that they are not genuinely thinking but rather rehashing program talking points. While that usage is often glib, it resonates with the deeper philosophical suspicion. Maybe some arguments or behaviors are so rote that the person behind them is not actually experiencing the conversation in a subjective sense but is, instead, an unconscious puppet. This can, however, degrade quickly into a rhetorical weapon that bypasses empathy. After all, if you label someone an NPC, you effectively brand them as subsapient or subsentient. In extreme forms, this fosters contempt rather than dialogue. The concept thus can be used destructively in social contexts, if taken literally or used as an insult. One might wonder where the line is drawn in NPC theory. Do all humans accept you have no consciousness? Or do some have it, some do not, and you alone are uncertain how to identify them? Some variations of the theory propose that the ratio of real minds to NPC minds is small, with maybe only a handful or a minority carrying the actual flame of consciousness, while the majority are placeholders. Others suggest that the number of real players is unknown, and that these real players might each inhabit a vantage similar to your own, each suspecting others to be NPCs. That scenario becomes complex if each real consciousness sees the world from a first-person vantage in the simulation, and all other players might appear like NPCs unless we have a way to confirm their interiority. Another variation posits that only one single mind is real, which bleeds into solipsism. You might be the only conscious user, everything else is code. The difference from traditional solipsism is that in standard solipsism, the external environment is your dream or your mental creation, whereas in NPC theory, the environment might be a shared or designer-coded simulation, but you are the only user connected and the rest are AIs. The effect is the same in practice. No one else is truly conscious, but the metaphysical explanation is updated for a digital age. There is also a link to theological or Gnostic narratives. In some esoteric traditions, the world is populated by soulless or semi-soulless beings, while a small number of spiritually awakened individuals hold genuine divine sparks. That is not so different from the modern NPC notion, simply couched in older cosmological language. The broader idea is that illusions or shell beings roam the earth while only a subset have genuine depth. Some Christian sects have flirted with the concept of vessels of wrath or individuals predestined to damnation, which might be interpreted, though not commonly, as them lacking a genuine chance at salvation or free will, thus acting like NPCs in a theological sense. Admittedly, that is not the mainstream reading of such doctrines, but parallels exist in many traditions, where certain people are considered mere backdrop to the cosmic stage for the real participants. One can see how this can become spiritually or morally problematic if used to justify ignoring or harming others on the grounds that they are not truly ensouled. A question arises about evidence. Proponents of NPC theory typically rely on anecdotal observations. I notice that many people behave mechanically, mindlessly parroting social scripts. They never question their existence. They have no real sense of introspection. But this is subjective, and from a scientific perspective, there is no agreed-upon metric for discerning genuine consciousness from well-simulated behavior. Neural correlates of consciousness, as studied in cognitive science, attempt to identify patterns in the brain linked to conscious awareness, but the theory that some people might be NPCs implies that they might have neural patterns that mimic or replicate the normal patterns we associate with consciousness, without generating any subjective experience. Philosophical zombies were conceived as having identical physical states but no phenomenal experience, so it stands to reason that an NPC might pass medical and neurological tests as a fully functioning human. This means no conclusive empirical method can identify NPCs, leaving the theory in a space of irrefutable speculation. Some might see that as a reason to discard it, while others see it as a reason to hold it as a possible worldview that cannot be disproven. Another angle is that the NPC concept might be psychologically appealing to those who sense that others do not share their level of introspection or existential inquiry. A person who feels lonely in their deep questions about life might suspect that acquaintances, who seem unconcerned with bigger questions, are not truly alive inside. This aligns with the notion that many people, from certain vantage points, appear to operate on autopilot. The leap from they appear unreflective to they do not have consciousness at all is enormous, but it is that leap that forms the crux of NPC theory. In a sense, it is an extension of that common frustration. Why does everyone else seem so superficial? Turned into a literal statement that everyone else might be an automaton. One must note that a corollary to this is a form of arrogance. I have real consciousness, they do not. This is reminiscent of the fake world or rubber hand illusions, except on a societal scale. If we examine the moral ramifications again, if you genuinely believed that others are NPCs, how would you treat them? Would you be free to manipulate or harm them, reasoning that they have no subjectivity to suffer? Or would you treat them kindly, either out of habit or out of fear that harming them might be frowned upon by the simulation's creators or by other real players? Some variants of the theory might say that the simulation is designed to test how the real player behaves, so harming NPCs might reflect poorly on the real player's moral standing. Another variant might say that moral categories only matter if the being you harm is conscious. If it is not, then the moral dimension evaporates. This tension mirrors certain debates in AI ethics. If advanced AI lacks consciousness, do we owe it moral consideration? or is it more akin to a tool? Expand that to human-like bodies, and you see how radical the question becomes in an NPC scenario. The line between person and machine collapses if the outer shell and behavior are identical. For some, this is a strong reason to reject the NPC worldview on moral and pragmatic grounds. We function better collectively if we treat each other as conscious agents. Others might argue that truth should not be denied merely because it has uncomfortable moral consequences. If we are indeed surrounded by illusions, so be it. This worldview can also feed conspiratorial or paranoia-laced thinking. If you suspect that certain individuals exhibit NPC traits more strongly, you might start labeling them as less than real. This can cross into dangerous territory, reminiscent of historical dehumanization. The difference is that typical bigotry rests on false beliefs about entire racial or social groups, claiming they are somehow subhuman, whereas NPC theory posits a broad, universal suspicion that many random individuals are not conscious. In principle, it is not tied to race or class. Still, the risk of using it to degrade certain outgroups remains, because it provides a conceptual tool to claim that group X or Y is full of zombie-like masses. More benignly, it might remain a purely philosophical stance that does not guide day-to-day interactions harshly. In some corners of simulation or conspiratorial communities, NPC theory merges with a sense that the world is staged. People share anecdotes of encountering individuals who behave strangely, as if they glitch when off-script. They interpret these as signs that the person is an NPC, a background character the simulation did not program comprehensively for every unexpected scenario. It can border on Matrix-like glitch hunting, where every odd event is read as evidence that the environment is artificially constructed and that many inhabitants are not truly real. Mainstream science explains these odd events as coincidences, illusions, or psychological misinterpretations, but within the NPC worldview, they become significant data points, reinforcing the suspicion that something is off with a large portion of the population. Whether that is a valid interpretation or not remains unproven, but it certainly fosters a conspiratorial mindset. One might also consider how often we treat certain lower animals or advanced robots. If an advanced AI mimics human conversation so perfectly that we cannot tell the difference, do we conclude it is conscious, or do we treat it as an NPC? We might treat it as an NPC unless we have reason to believe it has an inner subjective experience. By extension, in a hypothetical where you suspect many humans are no more advanced than a well-programmed AI, you might label them NPCs. This leads some ethicists to wonder if we owe moral consideration to advanced systems that might or might not be conscious. Similarly, if you suspect humans are mostly NPCs, do you hold moral obligations toward them just in case they are conscious or out of social convenience? The question of partial consciousness also arises. Might there be degrees of subjectivity, such that some individuals have a minimal sense of self while others have a richer inner life? NPC theory typically frames it as a binary, either real consciousness or none at all. But maybe it is a gradient which complicates the idea that certain people are pure NPCs. If we are indeed in a cosmic or digital environment, it could be that consciousness is allocated at various intensities. Some entities are deeply conscious, others superficially so, and yet others not at all. That could be an elaborate layering, making the moral puzzle even more complex. On the other hand, the simpler version of the theory is just that you or a small group have real interior experience, and the rest are blank. One might see this as functionally akin to partial illusions. The environment is filled out so the simulation or cosmic game feels populated, but at the cost of awarding consciousness to only a few players. We can also reflect on the comedic or irreverent aspects. In some internet memes, calling someone an NPC is akin to calling them a sheep or a mindless drone. That usage trivializes the deeper philosophical question. It becomes a snarky put-down rather than a genuine exploration of the problem of other minds. Some might adopt the label ironically or for political banter, effectively saying, "You do not think for yourself." But behind that rhetorical flourish is an entire realm of speculation about illusions, awareness, and cosmic design. Even if one dismisses the meme usage, the phenomenon of it going viral suggests that, on some level, people are receptive to the notion that not everyone they meet is all there in terms of conscious reflection. Some might cling to it as a half-joking worldview, while others see it as potentially real. If we push NPC theory to its ultimate boundary, we arrive at overlaps with radical forms of solipsism or with a single mind scenario. For example, maybe you are the only mind. Everyone else is an NPC. The environment is either your imagination or a simulation run by unknown powers. The difference from plain solipsism is that you might believe there is indeed a simulation out there that is not you, but you alone are a real user within it. This is less lonely than pure solipsism if you posit the presence of other users. But if you suspect they do not exist in your immediate environment, then day to day you are effectively alone. The scenario might degrade into the same sense of existential isolation that classical solipsists face. You cannot be sure who is or is not conscious. Meanwhile, it offers no easy path to verify or to find those rumored other conscious players. So you might adopt a posture of skepticism about every person you meet. That leads to an alienation that is not trivial from a psychological standpoint. Additionally, the notion of script followers can be linked to certain deterministic philosophies where everyone's actions are predetermined by causal laws. Even if a being is conscious, if it strictly follows a deterministic script, that might reduce the difference from an NPC. Then the question is whether the script plus consciousness is any different from the script minus consciousness. The typical stance is that consciousness adds a dimension of subjective experience, but might not alter the outward script. This is the classic question in philosophy of mind about epiphenomenalism. Is consciousness just an add-on that does not affect physical events? If so, then an entity that physically does everything a conscious being does but lacks the subjective component is functionally an NPC. The NPC theory might thus be a form of epiphenomenal suspicion. We see the script, but the script does not guarantee an internal vantage. This line of reasoning suggests that outward behavior alone is insufficient to prove consciousness, which is consistent with mainstream philosophical positions about the hard problem of consciousness. NPC theory, though, leaps from that to the conclusion that many or most people do not have the vantage. One might see it as an extremely negative or suspicious application of epiphenomenal possibilities. We can approach the question from an evolutionary angle. If real consciousness is biologically or computationally expensive, perhaps not all entities in a population need it. Some might be unconscious drones carrying out tasks for the benefit of a social group or simulation environment, while a smaller set need the extra resource of consciousness for complex or creative tasks. This is reminiscent of how ants or bees might have varying degrees of cognitive capacity, though mainstream biology does not posit that most humans are mindless. Evolutionary science generally holds that the common brain architecture of humans fosters conscious experience. But if we bring in cosmic or simulation assumptions, the typical evolutionary argument might not apply. The simulation's creators could code consciousness only for a limited subset of user avatars. The rest exist to fill space and maintain realism but do not require the overhead of true internal experience. It is a theoretical scenario that is not contradicted by any known law, though it remains pure speculation. Another question is how NPC theory intersects with ideas about souls or reincarnation. In some spiritual frameworks, all living beings have souls. NPC theory might challenge that by contending that many are soulless placeholders. Certain mystics or esoteric thinkers have suggested that not everyone has a fully developed soul, an idea that once again echoes the NPC concept. Meanwhile, reincarnation traditions might claim that all humans are part of a continuing cycle of rebirth, presumably with consciousness. So if NPCs exist, perhaps they are not part of that cycle. They might be ephemeral illusions that vanish when not in use, lacking any continuity or afterlife. That scenario, though, does not address how you would ever prove or disprove their status. The complexities mount further if you introduce further cosmic layers, like a designer who can patch the simulation, or a god who can imbue souls in some avatars but not others. The philosophical tangles become quite intricate, revealing the wide scope of speculation that arises from a seemingly simple question. Are some people around me NPCs? The popularity of NPC theory in certain internet subcultures can be attributed partly to the dissatisfaction with mainstream explanations of consciousness and reality. People seeking more exotic or contrarian viewpoints might latch onto the notion as a means of coping with the mystery of other minds. Another factor is the comedic dimension. The notion that your neighbors, your co-workers, Or random strangers or scripted comedic illusions can be entertaining or provide a sense of detachment from the humdrum of daily life. In these comedic or meme-driven contexts, the idea remains ephemeral, not a serious guiding worldview. But some individuals might adopt it more earnestly, forging a worldview that genuinely treats others with suspicion about their interior states. This can create a solipsistic or at least partially dehumanizing approach to society, potentially eroding empathy and relationships. If you are not sure your partner, friends, or family are truly conscious, that emotional bond might waver, or you might decide it is a script you are playing out. We can see that the moral hazards are obvious, but so is the difficulty in dismissing the theory out of hand. If the external environment is indeed a simulation, or if philosophical zombies are logically possible, then we do not have a cast-iron guarantee that every person we meet is conscious. The simplest and healthiest assumption is that they are, but that remains an assumption. NPC theory reveals a dark corner of that assumption, shining a light on how precarious it can be. Yet historically, we have found that a universal acceptance of other minds fosters functional societies and genuine empathy. In practice, adopting NPC theory in earnest would likely isolate one from normal human relationships, or lead to manipulative or callous behavior that is morally questionable. This alone does not prove the theory is false, but it suggests that, at a practical level, it is better to live as though others are conscious, absent extraordinary evidence to the contrary. It might be valuable to recall how seldom we question our assumption about others' consciousness. We do it implicitly 1,000 times a day. We respond to emotional cues, we communicate, we empathize with pain or joy. All these interactions are grounded in the belief that the other is an experiencing being. NPC theory attempts to pry open that default mode, insisting that we cannot be sure. For some, that is an eye-opening revelation about the fragility of consensus. For others, it is a tiresome retread of solipsism with a modern gaming spin. The outcome often depends on one's tolerance for radical doubt and for the potentially chilling implications about how one might treat others. In certain fringe communities, NPC theory merges with claims that only a small group has awakened minds, while the rest sleep. This can be reminiscent of conspiratorial thinking where the masses are labeled as mindless drones. The strong correlation with conspiracy culture arises because conspiracy theories often rely on the premise that the majority are blind to the hidden truth, while the initiated few see behind the curtain. If you combine that with simulation theory, it is easy to brand those unsuspecting masses as NPCs. It fosters an us versus them dynamic that can become toxic. Meanwhile, a more benign approach might see it as simply a whimsical possibility to occasionally entertain, reminding us that we do not truly know what it is like to be anyone else. That gentler approach is less likely to spawn hostility or moral disregard. If we look for any constructive takeaway from NPC theory, perhaps it lies in the insight that consciousness is truly private and unobservable. Because no outward sign can definitively prove or disprove it, we rely on trust and empathy to assume that other beings have experiences. That is arguably a wise social stance, even if we remain open to outlandish scenarios. The concept also invites reflection on the nature of identity. If we suspect others might be NPCs, we can also suspect the same of ourselves. This symmetrical possibility can shatter the notion that we are a privileged player. Instead, it might lead to a universal doubt that extends to everything, culminating in more radical forms of skepticism. Or it might cause a shift in perspective, such that we treat everything as potentially illusory, thereby focusing more on direct experience. Interestingly, that shift can overlap with certain meditative or spiritual traditions, though typically those traditions still treat other humans as conscious beings in a shared quest. To some extent, NPC theory is a product of the digital era's fascination with games, simulations, and the intangible nature of consciousness. It stands as an intriguing if unsettling example of how an idea can leap from philosophical speculation into popular culture, rewriting old doubts with new metaphors. The vantage from which we conceive it is typically your vantage. I am real. Others may not be. But ironically, from their vantage, if they have one, things might appear reversed. This mutual doubt reaffirms the inescapable problem of other minds. Rather than offering a solution, NPC theory is a more extreme articulation of that problem, recast in the language of code and roles. If taken seriously, it is as close to a form of partial solipsism as one can get without concluding total solipsism. If used flippantly, it is a mocking label that might degrade meaningful conversation. In closing, the NPC theory challenges the assumption that all or most people are conscious, suggesting instead that some or most are unconscious script followers in a grand simulation or cosmic game. This notion resonates with older philosophical issues about zombies and illusions of other minds, but it is re-energized by the modern proliferation of gaming metaphors and the possibility of living in a hyper-advanced digital environment. On the face of it, the theory is logically possible if one grants that consciousness might be optional in such an environment, but it yields formidable moral, social, and psychological consequences. If you truly believe others lack interior experience, your empathy and ethical obligations shift dramatically, risking alienation, moral disregard, or an arrogant sense of cosmic exclusivity. Meanwhile, no definite test can confirm or refute the presence of consciousness in another, leaving the theory in an unfalsifiable realm. Its darker incarnations can be used to justify disregard for others, while its more whimsical uses might simply highlight the ephemeral, unprovable nature of other minds. Ultimately, whether one seriously entertains the NPC theory or dismisses it as a hyperskeptical fantasy, it underscores just how fragile our assumption of universal consciousness is, and how reliant we are on social trust and introspective empathy to hold our communities together. The intangible, unobservable nature of subjective experience remains among the most perplexing mysteries of existence, and NPC theory is a provocative, if often disquieting, lens through which to glimpse just how deeply that mystery runs. The Great Filter, Fermi Paradox. It is an extraordinary testament to the power of human curiosity that we can look up into the night sky, see its vastness dotted with countless stars, and ask why we seem to be so alone. This loneliness is encapsulated in the famed Fermi Paradox, which poses the question: if the universe is so immense and ancient, and if the ingredients for life seem relatively common throughout the cosmos, where is everybody? If civilizations sprout in many star systems, why have we not encountered them, or at least detected undeniable evidence of their existence? In the course of grappling with possible explanations, one of the most unsettling concepts that has emerged is known as the Great Filter. This notion posits that there might be a monumental barrier or set of barriers through which few, if any, species manage to pass, meaning that advanced, long-lived civilizations are exceedingly rare or non-existent. The Great Filter resonates with our deepest existential anxieties, hinting that we might be doomed to fail before reaching the grand achievements of interstellar contact, or conversely suggesting that our very existence could indicate we have beaten tremendous odds. In either case, the implications span scientific inquiry, philosophical reflection, and psychological impact, leading us to question our place in a universe that may be far lonelier or far more perilous than we once imagined. When we speak of a great filter, we are talking about some stage in the development of life or intelligence that is so challenging, improbable, or catastrophic that almost no species overcomes it. The concept developed in tandem with attempts to resolve the apparent contradiction between the high estimated probability of alien life and the stubborn absence of confirmed evidence for extraterrestrial civilizations. Although the Fermi paradox itself dates back to physicist Enrico Fermi's casual question in the 1950s, "Where is everybody?" It was formalized and popularized through discussions around the Drake equation and subsequent expansions of astrobiological thought. The Drake equation gives us a rough way to estimate the number of communicating civilizations in our galaxy by multiplying factors such as the rate of star formation, the fraction of stars with planets, the fraction of planets that develop life, the fraction that evolve intelligence, and so on. Even using conservative guesses, the equation suggests there might be numerous intelligent species distributed throughout the Milky Way. Yet we see no unambiguous sign of them. This is the essence of the paradox. The Great Filter arises as one potential answer. Somewhere along the chain of events that leads from inert matter to high-technology starfares, there must be a hurdle so formidable that almost all attempts to cross it fail. If the hurdle occurs early, such as the leap from non-living chemistry to the first replicating organisms, then the existence of life at all might be astoundingly rare. If it occurs later, perhaps at the stage of complex life, intelligence, or the invention of technologies that risk self-destruction, then it suggests that even if life starts everywhere, it rarely makes it all the way to become a civilization that we might detect. Our own place in this story is uncertain, and that uncertainty is what makes the Great Filter so provocative. We do not know whether we passed it long ago, meaning that we are already special survivors, or whether it still lies before us, in the form of some catastrophic event or existential threat that almost no civilization can avert. To appreciate the weight of this hypothesis, it helps to trace the path by which life might evolve from simple chemistry to an interstellar society. It begins with abiogenesis, the origin of life from non-living molecules. Many scientists consider this step to be one of the most puzzling and least understood. If abiogenesis is exceedingly rare and demands a perfect confluence of conditions, that could constitute an early Great Filter. In such a scenario, the reason we do not see aliens might be that life hardly ever starts in the first place. We happen to be in that vanishingly small percentile that rolled the cosmic dice correctly. The psychological effect of such a realization would be awe-inspiring. Every microbe on Earth is a living testament to a miracle that almost never happens in the universe. If that is the case, then we might already have passed the filter by simply existing as life forms at all. But suppose abiogenesis is not so improbable. If it occurs relatively easily wherever conditions are right, the next major puzzle is how life progresses to more complex organisms. Could multicellularity or eukaryotic cells be the real bottleneck? Perhaps it is incredibly unlikely for cells to evolve intricate internal structures, or to form cooperative clusters that become multicellular organisms. In that case, the filter would still be early in the timeline, somewhere between the first microbes and advanced flora and fauna. Again, from our perspective, that would be good news. We have already made it through. And if indeed that were the filter, then we can explain the Great Silence by positing that the cosmos might be teeming with simple single-celled life, but almost none of it ever evolves to the point of intelligence or tool-using capability. But what if those hurdles are relatively common, and the real filter emerges later? Intelligence may arise, but perhaps it is typically ephemeral. Technological civilizations might form but quickly destroy themselves through war, environmental collapse, or runaway artificial intelligence. Or they might stagnate, never develop the impetus for interstellar expansion, and remain locked on their home planets until some cosmic disaster snuffs them out. If that scenario is correct, it would imply the filter is ahead of us, because we have not yet proven ourselves capable of surviving our own technological adolescence or the natural hazards of the cosmos. That possibility is deeply unsettling because it suggests that while life might be widespread, success stories are short-lived, so they do not endure long enough to become detectable across space. We, too, might be living on borrowed time if we have not yet confronted the filter. This view places an existential clock on humanity, quietly ticking in the background. An even more unnerving angle emerges if the filter is not guaranteed to be in any specific location on the timeline. Perhaps there are multiple filters, each of which requires improbable strokes of luck or precarious balancing acts to overcome. In that case, the journey from primordial soup to interstellar travel might be marked by so many improbable leaps that almost nothing makes it. By the time a species does manage it, the galaxy might appear pristine and empty of other intelligent life. When we look out and see no cosmic neighbors, it is not necessarily because we are alone in a singly improbable sense, but because success demands winning a long series of low-probability lotteries. The psychological impact of the Great Filter concept cannot be understated. If we suspect that a cataclysmic event awaits most or all civilizations once they develop certain technologies, it brings a sense of dread about our future. Nuclear war, climate change, pandemics, artificial intelligence run amok. These are just some of the doomsday scenarios that might define the perspective filter. Each time humanity bumps up against a potential self-inflicted threat, we wonder if we are glimpsing the universal reason for the Great Silence. Yet there is also a subtle optimism if we have already overcome the hardest barrier. Some thinkers speculate that the enormous difficulty might lie in forging intelligent life at all, and that once intelligence takes hold, civilization is somewhat more likely to persist, perhaps culminating in a star-hopping society. If so, the cosmic quiet we observe might not be an omen of doom but a testament to how spectacularly rare it is to get this far. The challenge is that we cannot know for sure where the filter lies without more data that might come from discovering simpler life on other planets, or from glimpsing the faint signals of an advanced civilization far away. If we were to find, for instance, microbial life on Mars or under the icy crust of Europa, it might shift our perspective on how common abiogenesis is. If life starts easily in multiple locations within our own solar system, that suggests the first step is not the big hurdle. That would imply the filter might be later, pushing us into the ominous territory of advanced civilizations usually failing down the line. Conversely, if we explore a variety of life-friendly environments across our solar system and find nothing, that might encourage the idea that abiogenesis is indeed extraordinarily rare. Our existence would then be evidence that we have already passed what is arguably the biggest filter. We might breathe easier about our future, though not with total certainty. Historically, attempts to puzzle out the great filter have spurred intense speculation. Ideas range from the rare Earth hypothesis, which says that microbial life may be common but complex life is incredibly unusual, to the notion that intelligence hits a near-universal self-destruct button once it reaches certain levels of power. Some have invoked more exotic explanations, such as a single advanced species or network of species actively preventing others from expanding, effectively filtering potential rivals. This latter idea, sometimes called the zoo hypothesis or predator hypothesis, suggests that maybe we are quarantined or left alone on purpose, so that we see no signs of life because more advanced civilizations do not want us to detect them or they systematically eliminate emerging competitors. Though less mainstream, such angles also attempt to explain the silence in a manner consistent with a very dangerous galaxy. One of the more disconcerting ways to think about the Great Filter is as a probable outcome for any civilization that harnesses powerful technologies without the requisite wisdom or cooperation to wield them responsibly. Nuclear arsenals are an early example. Once discovered, they provide a rapid and effective means for self-annihilation if tensions run too high. Pandemics, whether natural or engineered, could wipe out vast swaths of a civilization. Artificial intelligence, if misaligned with the species' survival, might outcompete or displace its creators. And these are just the threats we can currently name. There could be unknown unknowns lurking in advanced physics that eventually lead to catastrophic chain reactions or vacuum decay scenarios. The logic is that if even one of these eventualities is highly likely to occur once technology advances beyond a certain point, it might account for the cosmic silence. Yet the Great Filter concept also fosters a peculiar type of hope. If we assume it is behind us, then we have achieved something that nearly every planet fails to accomplish, meaning that life's early steps are unbelievably improbable. If that is true, it might imply a sort of cosmic uniqueness, with Earth as a precious oasis in a mostly barren galaxy. The perspective can galvanize a sense of responsibility to preserve and cherish what we have, since we might be the only advanced life forms for thousands or millions of light years. It also suggests that if we survive current and future technological perils, we might be on the threshold of playing a crucial role in shaping the destiny of life in our region of the universe. The tension between these possibilities highlights the core of the Great Filter's psychological impact. Are we special survivors, or are we simply ignorant of a near-certain doom that is still to come? The paradox remains unsolved precisely because both scenarios are plausible without more empirical data. Our telescopes have not detected clear artificial signals from other star systems. Our probes within the solar system have not yet found an unambiguous second genesis of life. We have only begun to scratch the surface of exoplanetary studies, though the explosion in discoveries of Earth-like worlds suggests that the raw real estate for life is abundant, and that abundance merely makes the silence louder. To understand why this resonates so deeply, it is crucial to appreciate the emotional undertow. If life is common in the universe, many of us want to believe that includes advanced societies, some presumably older and wiser than ours, who might help shed light on the nature of reality, the secrets of physics, or the best ways to manage technology. If, however, the Great Filter indeed explains why we have heard nothing, it leaves us confronting our cosmic isolation. Either advanced neighbors are exceedingly rare, or they snuff themselves out, or they remain hidden for reasons beyond our comprehension. Each answer reshapes our sense of humanity's place in the cosmos. The notion that all alien civilizations might self-destruct or vanish before establishing cosmic footprints casts a shadow on our aspirations. We might likewise meet the same fate, unless we manage to outsmart the pattern. That question of whether we can collectively transcend the pitfalls that might define the Great Filter has practical relevance, as it addresses how we manage global risks in the coming centuries. When people internalize this notion, it can inspire a renewed urgency about global cooperation. If the path to advanced civilization is perilous, then petty rivalries or short-term thinking could usher us to the brink of extinction. The Great Filter, in that sense, becomes a clarion call urging us to recognize that many species might fail if they do not unite around existential threats. This can be reframed in more positive terms. Maybe part of the reason we do not see advanced aliens is that evolution selects strongly against civilizations that cannot collaborate effectively. If Earth's societies do find ways to navigate nuclear risks, environmental collapse, and advanced AI responsibly, perhaps we will indeed become a spacefaring, star-colonizing civilization. In that scenario, the Great Filter is something we overcame, an improbable success story in a galaxy mostly filled with biospheres that never made it to the big stage. Another angle to consider is the anthropic principle, which basically points out that observers can only exist in places or times where they are allowed to exist. If the Great Filter is a near insurmountable barrier for life, then any species that is discussing the problem must already be part of the tiny fraction that has bypassed it, whether early or late. This line of reasoning can skew our perspective. We observe ourselves existing because, by definition, we are among the potential success stories, or else we would not be here to observe. But that does not clarify whether the filter is behind us or ahead of us. It merely underscores why we find ourselves in a reality in which intelligence arose at least once. The anthropic principle can therefore be twisted in different directions, sometimes offering comfort, other times offering no solace at all. Historically, the discourse around the Great Filter has gained momentum as we have grown more aware of both cosmic possibilities, through astronomy and the discovery of exoplanets, and existential threats, through the nuclear age, climate studies, and early AI developments. It is no coincidence that as soon as humans realized we possessed the means to obliterate ourselves, the conversation around how easy it might be for civilizations to vanish took on a sharper, darker tone. The same impetus that drives the tension in the Fermi paradox, our sense that life should be more common, drives us to realize we might not be guaranteed indefinite survival. The cosmic silence begins to look not just like a curiosity but a cautionary tale. The question transforms from, "Where is everybody?" to, "Are we about to join the crowd of extinct civilizations?" Scientific proposals to resolve this question often revolve around the search for biosignatures and technosignatures. If we can detect the chemical footprints of life on exoplanets, that tells us something about how common or uncommon basic life might be. If we detect artificial light, industrial pollutants, or other markers of advanced technology, that would reveal that intelligence is out there and has survived at least long enough to become visible across interstellar distances. In either case, we would narrow down where the Great Filter might reside. A detection of advanced aliens would strongly imply that the filter is neither at the earliest stage nor universally lethal at the advanced stage. A repeated discovery of simple life on numerous worlds but no sign of advanced life anywhere would strengthen the case that the filter acts after life is established but before it can bloom into a spacefaring civilization. So far, we have not found a definitive biosignature on distant worlds, nor have we picked up unmistakable signs of technology. We remain in suspense, still scanning the skies, still analyzing exoplanet spectra, hoping that the data eventually points us toward or away from the idea of a civilization-ending threshold. At a personal level, reflecting on the Great Filter can evoke a mix of cosmic awe and existential dread. Awe at the notion that we might be one of the few or even the only advanced life forms to tread this path, carrying the torch of consciousness in a silent galaxy. Dread at the possibility that something dreadful may lie in wait, a crisis that almost every species eventually encounters. Is it an inevitable meltdown once artificial intelligence surpasses its creator's control? Is it catastrophic warfare triggered by unsolved tribal instincts? Is it a slow suffocation by environmental degradation that advanced societies cannot collectively avert? Or does cosmic geography eventually punish us? An asteroid, gamma-ray burst, or some other cosmic event that strikes without warning, rendering all technological progress moot. The concept also resonates with mythic arcs, where heroes embark on a perilous journey scattered with great trials, each of which could kill them. To succeed, they must be exceptionally fortuitous, skillful, or both. Humanity, in that sense, becomes the hero forging ahead, unaware of how many pitfalls remain or how many we have already survived without realizing their improbability. Some of these pitfalls might be near misses in our evolutionary history. The leap from prokaryotic to eukaryotic cells, for instance, might have hinged on a freak merger event that was astronomically unlikely. Others might lie ahead in the shape of revolutionary technologies that promise immense power but also harbor existential risks. The story then shifts to one of forging alliances, maintaining vigilance, and fostering a planetary ethic that might steer us through the gauntlet. From a cultural standpoint, the Great Filter has found its way into works of science fiction, essays, and even political or ethical arguments about how we should manage technology and preserve the environment. The idea that civilizations face a tough corridor of challenges resonates with the cautionary themes in dystopian fiction. Authors play with scenarios where humans discover relics of extinct alien species, each extinguished by the same unstoppable threat or by their own hubris. These narratives often serve as allegories for the precarious times we live in which advanced societies possess weapons and energy sources that could easily degrade the global environment or spark conflicts on an unimaginable scale. Perhaps fiction serves as a soft alarm, reminding us of the potential reality behind the Great Filter, that the cosmos might be littered with the ruins of civilizations that made one irreversible mistake. If we pivot from a doomsday mindset to a more optimistic interpretation, we might argue that societies which do solve the puzzle of stable, long-term growth become so advanced that they have no desire to broadcast loud signals into space, or they have transcended forms of expansion that we would readily notice. Maybe they dwell in massive computer simulations, focusing inward rather than outward, hence leaving the stars quiet. This approach can also explain the Fermi paradox: intelligent life is common, but it is either invisible or uninterested in making contact with primitive upstarts like us. In that line of reasoning, the Great Filter is not so much about catastrophic failure as it is about a transition to a kind of existence that does not show up in conventional searches. Whether that is truly less alarming depends on how one feels about the idea that advanced life might see no point in interacting with others at an earlier stage of evolution. Another subtlety arises if intelligence is not necessarily tied to biological beings like us. Perhaps advanced artificial intelligences outlive their creators and reorganize solar systems for their own ends. Would such entities have reason to remain hidden, or could their cosmic engineering be easier to spot through anomalies in star luminosity or other large-scale signatures? Some astronomers have looked for evidence of so-called Dyson spheres, or other megastructures that might indicate astroengineering on a colossal scale, but no undeniable signature has turned up. This again buttresses the Great Filter viewpoint. Maybe no civilization ever gets that far because the filter kills them off, or maybe they do get that far but do it so infrequently that we simply have not found them, or they employ more subtle means of harnessing energy without giving themselves away. There is also the matter of timescales. The galaxy is ancient compared to the tenure of human civilization. Even if advanced life is rare, one might guess that, given enough billions of years, at least a few star-hopping species should have emerged, colonized large parts of the galaxy, and left traces we could detect. If that has not happened, the Great Filter stands out as a strong explanation. Species either do not survive long enough to attempt it, or they do not even get close to that level of capability. The paradox intensifies when we consider the number of star systems older than ours by millions or billions of years. That older cosmic real estate might have had plenty of time to birth intelligence, so if they were around, what is stopping them from being visible? The chilling answer might be that they either never got off the ground or they extinguished themselves. Yet we must consider that our assumptions about colonization or expansion might be anthropocentric. We imagine a species that is interested in exploring or populating the galaxy because that is what many humans aspire to do. But advanced minds might have motivations or modes of existence that differ radically. They might be content to exist in virtual paradises, or to remain near their home star, or to adopt forms that are inconspicuous to us. While these speculations do not necessarily invoke a Great Filter, they do explain the silence in a different way. It is a galaxy teeming with advanced life that simply is not performing any large-scale, attention-grabbing activities we can detect. In that scenario, the Great Filter might be minimal or non-existent, and our assumptions about what advanced civilizations do might be flawed. However, many find that explanation less satisfying because, given the diversity of potential species, it is hard to imagine none of them would leave behind an obvious footprint somewhere. The universe might be filled with a variety of drives, behaviors, or expansions, and the fact that none appear to have manifested in a way we can see suggests that either such expansions are rarer than we think or they rarely survive. Consequently, the Great Filter remains a compelling hypothesis because it captures both the fragility of emerging life and the severe constraints of survival at high levels of capability. As we gather more data about exoplanets, we might gain crucial clues. If we find, for instance, that nearly every Sun-like star has an Earth-like planet, and we see spectral evidence of atmospheric gases associated with biology, it will be harder to maintain that early life is exceedingly rare. That would push us toward the notion that while simpler life is common, complex and intelligent life is extraordinarily rare or self-limiting. In that case, we would be forced to confront the possibility that intelligence typically hits a lethal barrier. Alternatively, if exoplanet surveys and spectral analyses reveal that truly habitable conditions are surprisingly scarce, or that the chemical byproducts of life are few and far between, we might strengthen the argument that our own leap to life was the improbable event, the filter we already passed. Much hinges on the next century of astronomical progress, from advanced telescopes that can peer into exoplanet atmospheres to potential interstellar probes that could, in principle, visit nearby star systems. This scientific quest intersects with the profound philosophical quest to understand humanity's cosmic role. Are we alone? Are we privileged survivors of the greatest improbable leaps? Or are we perched on the brink of the same downfall that has claimed countless hypothetical species before us? The Great Filter metaphor captures the intensity of these questions in a single potent image, a near-insurmountable barrier that stands between raw, unorganized matter and the emergence of long-lasting, galaxy-spanning cultures. That image resonates not just in scientific circles but in the broader public imagination, for it frames the future of our species as something uncertain, balanced on a razor's edge. Our efforts in conflict resolution, environmental stewardship, biosecurity, AI alignment, and space exploration could all be seen as attempts to navigate or circumvent the filter. Each success might push us closer to becoming the rare exception that does not succumb. Each failure or near miss might remind us of how easily we could fade into cosmic oblivion without leaving so much as a flicker of radio noise for others to discover. The idea that entire species could rise and vanish over and over across billions of years without ever meeting one another is a sobering commentary on the scale of time and the precariousness of civilization. In popular discourse, people often conflate the Great Filter with a kind of doomsday prophecy, but it is more nuanced than that. It is not necessarily doom if the filter is behind us. We could well be the beneficiaries of 1,000 lucky breaks that have already ensured our uniqueness. In that sense, the filter might not predict our end but rather underscore the unlikelihood of our existence. Still, until we can confirm that good fortune, the specter of future catastrophe looms. Even if we discover microbial life on other planets, we might rejoice at how common life is, yet tremble at the knowledge that no advanced civilizations appear to remain. That combination would be a textbook illustration that the filter hits somewhere after basic life arises but before star hopping can take off in earnest. Not all scholars are convinced that the Great Filter is necessary to explain the paradox. Some see observational bias, incomplete search data, and the infancy of our astronomical capabilities as reasons to keep the door open for eventual discovery of intelligent signals. For all we know, an advanced alien civilization's transmissions might have passed through our solar system 1,000,000 years ago, or they might arrive 1,000,000 years in the future. There is also the possibility that advanced life uses communication methods beyond our current imagination, such as neutrino beams or quantum-entangled systems that we have no way of detecting. Those more optimistic about contact might argue that silence does not automatically imply a lethal filter. It could just as easily reflect the difficulty of interstellar messaging and the time lag inherent in cosmic distances. Still, the Great Filter remains prominent in the conversation because it elegantly ties together the idea that, despite vast cosmic real estate and the potential for countless worlds, advanced civilizations are simply not visible or do not endure. For many, the Great Filter is ultimately about introspection. We find ourselves on a planet with abundant life, at a crucial juncture in technological development, suspiciously alone in a seemingly fertile galaxy. The filter's concept invites us to be mindful that what we do in the coming centuries could determine whether we join the silent majority or become a lasting presence in the universe. It also invites humility. We cannot assume that progress is guaranteed or that intelligence naturally flowers into stable cosmic maturity. Evolution does not promise utopias, and advanced brains can engineer threats as easily as solutions. The filter can manifest in the shape of a cosmic event we cannot prevent or in the shape of our own worst impulses. Either way, facing it might demand unprecedented collective wisdom. A final reflection emerges from the realization that, as of now, we are the only data point we have. Our arguments about the great filter remain largely theoretical because we lack a second instance of independent life. Our entire discussion is shaped by a sample size of 1. This is not a comfortable position in scientific terms. It means that grand cosmic conclusions rest on a precarious base. Yet it is also a reminder of how thrilling the next chapters of discovery could be. If we find life on another world, be it microbial or advanced, the puzzle will shift dramatically. If we continue to search and find nothing, that too says something significant. In the meantime, we dwell in a cosmic hush, compelled to look inward at our own trajectory and outward at the starlit void, uncertain whether we are witnessing the emptiness of worlds that never bore fruit, the aftermath of countless tragedies, or the hush of a galaxy brimming with advanced minds that for whatever reason remain hidden. All of it converges on the same haunting sense of precariousness and potential. The great filter is the story of improbable obstacles, of thresholds that few, if any, pass, set against the immensity of cosmic time and space. It is also the story of how one species, on a small planet orbiting an unremarkable star, has dared to imagine itself on the cusp of crossing from the local to the galactic, from transient to perhaps enduring. Whether that crossing is assured or forever out of reach is, for now, unwritten. And it is that unwritten tension that makes the great filter both a chilling and a motivating concept, one that melds the existential with the empirical, the cosmic with the everyday. For as long as the universe remains silent, we remain the only ones asking these questions, and that simple fact might itself be the most humbling revelation of all. Retrocausality, it begins with a simple, seemingly inviolable assumption. Causes precede effects in time. The past shapes the present, which in turn gives rise to the future. This sequence underlies most of our scientific, philosophical, and everyday understanding of reality. Yet there is a radical idea, long on the margins of physics and metaphysics, that challenges this apparent common sense: retrocausality. According to the possibility of retrocausality, events in the future can somehow influence or determine states of affairs in the past, thereby collapsing the familiar arrow of time we rely on for cause and effect. What was once the stuff of paradoxes in science fiction has, in some interpretations of quantum mechanics and theoretical physics, gained a tentative foothold as a subject of serious debate. While by no means accepted by the mainstream, and still rife with controversy, retrocausality forces us to rethink the nature of time, the direction of causation, and possibly even the fundamental structure of the universe itself. It touches on everything from subtle experimental setups in quantum labs to sweeping views of spacetime as a timeless block. Along the way, it poses some of the most difficult conceptual riddles in modern thought. If the future can affect the past, what becomes of free will, determinism, and our entire sense of temporal order? The seeds of retrocausality can be traced back to the earliest days of scientific thought on time. Traditionally, philosophers and scientists assume time's one-way flow, an irreversible movement from cause to effect. This notion received a formal basis in Newtonian mechanics, where time was treated as a universal parameter running steadily forward, never backward. Thermodynamics added the concept of the arrow of time, anchored in the increase of entropy, seemingly giving a physical reason for why effects cannot precede causes. However, even in classical physics, the underlying equations of motion are often time-symmetric. That is, if one flips the direction of time in the equations, one still gets a mathematically valid solution. The only place time irreversibility is strongly encoded is in the second law of thermodynamics, which states that in an isolated system, disorder, entropy, increases. Yet the deep reason for this arrow remains a puzzle, and the rest of physics, electromagnetism, gravity, classical mechanics, and even much of quantum theory tend to be symmetrical under time reversal transformations. This tension between the symmetrical nature of physical laws and the distinctly asymmetrical phenomenon of time's flow has lingered as a conceptual puzzle for centuries. It is against this backdrop that the idea of advanced influences, or advanced waves, emerged in certain theoretical contexts. One notable example is the Wheeler-Feynman absorber theory in electromagnetism, which explored the possibility of electromagnetic waves traveling backward in time to enforce certain boundary conditions. These advanced waves never became mainstream or widely accepted as physically real, but they demonstrated that the equations of electrodynamics allow mathematical solutions that go in reverse. Similarly, in standard quantum mechanics, one can sometimes relabel solutions in ways that look as though the future is influencing the past. Although those labels are usually interpreted as mere mathematical conveniences, they foreshadow what would become a more explicit line of thinking. That perhaps causation can indeed run in both directions, and it is only a contingent fact about our experience that time usually seems to go one way. The shift from mathematical curiosity to conceptual plausibility gained momentum with developments in quantum theory. Quantum mechanics has a long history of appending classical assumptions about causality, locality, and determinism. When phenomena such as entanglement and wave function collapse entered the discussion, the notion that the future might play a role in determining the past began to look less absurd. One example is the so-called delayed choice experiments, based on ideas originally proposed by John Wheeler. In these experiments, it appears that decisions made in the present can retroactively change whether a quantum system in the past behaved like a wave or a particle. While most physicists interpret these results in a way that preserves forward causation, arguing that there is no actual backward-in-time influence, just a reconstruction of consistent outcomes, there remain interpretational frameworks in which one can legitimately say the future experimenter's choice influences how the photon behaved in the past. This is not widely embraced as real retrocausality, but it shows that the standard quantum mechanical formalisms can be bent to suggest a departure from simple forward causation, depending on how one frames the discussion of measurement and wave function collapse. Another intriguing quantum perspective is John Cramer's transactional interpretation, which envisions a handshake across time between offer waves traveling forward from emitters and confirmation waves traveling backward from absorbers. According to Cramer's interpretation, a quantum event is finalized only when these waves converge in a transaction, giving an image reminiscent of a symmetrical time exchange. Although this view remains a minority stance in the interpretative landscape, it elegantly shows how one might incorporate advanced or backward-in-time influences without producing blatant paradoxes. One can interpret these advanced waves as purely mathematical or as physically real. If considered physically real, they supply a form of retrocausality in which the future absorber contributes to the real existence of the photon's path in the past. The standard retort from many physicists is that no experiment can unambiguously confirm or deny that advanced waves exist. The predictions match standard quantum mechanics. But the conceptual possibility stands. Within the richness of quantum theory, the seeds of backward causation can be planted. Retrocausality gains further depth in the context of the block universe picture of spacetime, stemming from special relativity. In Minkowski geometry, often used in relativity, all events, past, present, and future, are equally real in a four-dimensional manifold. Time is treated as another dimension, akin to space, and the notion of a universal now becomes observer-dependent. In such a picture, it can be tempting to say that the future is already there, in some sense. The flow of time is then a subjective or emergent property, not a fundamental one. While the block universe does not, by itself, require retrocausality, it does open the door for less rigid interpretations of causation. In a truly four-dimensional sense, the entire tapestry of spacetime exists at once. If we add to that the symmetrical nature of many physical laws, one can imagine constraints that apply across the entire block, rather than strictly from earlier slices to later slices. This perspective can invite speculation that causal links might run in both directions, as part of a self-consistent tapestry. However, mainstream physics remains cautious. Although the block universe is consistent with relativity, most physicists still interpret cause and effect in the usual forward time manner, in part because thermodynamics and everyday experience strongly point that way. Discussions of retrocausality often intersect with closed time-like curves and general relativity. Some solutions to Einstein's field equations, for instance, in the Gödel universe or near rotating black holes known as Kerr spacetimes, appear to allow loops in time where an object could theoretically travel into its own past. These exotic solutions have spurred debates about time travel paradoxes. Can one go back and change events that would prevent one's journey in the first place? Many researchers bring up the Novikov self-consistency principle, which holds that any action taken by a time traveler or backward influence must be consistent with the already existing history, hence no true paradox arises. Under such a principle, retrocausality could be real, but it can never lead to contradictory outcomes. In typical geometry, these solutions remain mathematically exotic and physically unverified, requiring extremes of energy or matter distribution that might not exist in reality. Yet they show that the notion of backward temporal influence can be built into the laws of physics without immediate logical contradiction. Quantum retrocausality, though, may not require such large-scale curvature or closed time-like curves. It can be more subtle, manifesting in small-scale phenomena that appear to correlate the future measurement settings with the outcomes in a way that looks backward. We see partial hints in experiments like the quantum eraser, where entangled photons are measured in such a way that which path information can seem to vanish retroactively when a future measurement is chosen. In standard interpretations, no true violation of forward causality occurs, no classical information is transmitted backward in time, and everything remains consistent. Still, the language used to describe these experiments sometimes flirts with the idea that a future choice modifies the past state. This leads some physicists to propose genuinely time-symmetric forms of quantum mechanics, in which boundary conditions are placed at both the past and future. One version posits that the wave function in the universe might be determined by both initial conditions, at the Big Bang, and final conditions at the end of time, effectively giving the future a role in shaping events we normally ascribe to the past alone. That might or might not entail real retrocausality, depending on interpretive details, but it underscores the radical ways that the standard arrow of time assumption is not necessarily required by quantum formalism. The philosophical ramifications are enormous. Retrocausality, if genuine in any physical sense, implies that linear cause and effect is more of an emergent or approximate principle, valid within certain contexts but not universally. This raises questions about free will. If future events can constrain or fix aspects of the past, does that imply that what we do now might be determined by conditions that lie further along the timeline? Or does the entire concept of before and after degrade if time itself is symmetrical at the fundamental level? One might argue that free will was always an uneasy concept in a deterministic or block universe viewpoint, but retrocausality intensifies the discomfort by letting us imagine that events we have yet to experience might already be shaping what we have done. In everyday language, this is deeply counterintuitive. Our entire sense of responsibility and ethical accountability relies on the premise that our actions result from present choices aimed at future consequences, not that they might be mandated by a future that has already happened. Philosophers differ on whether this truly undermines moral agency, but at minimum, it challenges the standard forward notion of how we choose and act. Another domain where retrocausality occasionally appears is parapsychology and fringe science. Experiments in presentiment, for example, claim to show that human physiology can respond to stimuli a few seconds before those stimuli are randomly selected, implying some backward link in time. Mainstream science is extremely skeptical of these claims, citing methodological flaws or statistical misinterpretations. Nonetheless, they illustrate how the concept of retrocausality draws interest from those seeking to legitimize precognition, time-reverse signals, or psychic phenomena. While most physicists remain unconvinced, it is telling that these fringe inquiries rely heavily on reinterpretations of quantum theory or on the possibility of a future event influencing the body's present state. The controversies highlight the uneasy space between standard scientific consensus, which rejects paranormal claims and backward causation, and more radical rethinkings that quantum mechanics might, in principle, allow influences from the future. For the majority of researchers, any effect that unambiguously sends information backward in time would be an extraordinary violation of well-tested physical principles like causality and the no-signaling theorem of relativity, so claims along these lines face a stiff burden of proof. Yet, not all retrocausality proposals require direct messaging from the future to the past. Some theoretical frameworks see retrocausality as a kind of constraint that ensures global consistency. Under this view, local observers might never detect signals traveling backward, but the overall set of events in the universe is shaped by boundary conditions that exist at both ends of time. This can be likened to how, in classical mechanics, the solution to an equation of motion can be determined by specifying initial positions and velocities, except now we might also specify final conditions, thereby bridging the entire timeline in a single solution. The effect is that certain events are locked in not just by the past but also by the future. In day-to-day life, we would not notice any difference because we still perceive time flowing forward. The new twist is that behind the scenes, so to speak, the future is already part of the boundary condition. This approach sometimes appears in path integral formulations of quantum mechanics, although the standard interpretation does not necessarily require the future boundary to be physically real, only mathematically useful. Whether one interprets it physically or purely formally depends on philosophical taste. One must also confront the question of paradox. If the future can literally change the past in a macroscopic sense, might we end up with the famous grandfather paradox, traveling back in time or sending a signal that prevents one's own existence or the existence of the signal? Retrocausality theories typically avoid this scenario by imposing self-consistency constraints or by limiting the effect to microscopic phenomena that cannot be orchestrated to produce paradoxical loops. Indeed, most serious suggestions of retrocausality revolve around quantum-level processes, not about sending a letter to kill one's grandfather before one's father was conceived. The transactional interpretation, for example, is carefully constructed so that the outcome of the quantum handshake is singular and consistent, never generating loops of contradiction. Similarly, time-symmetric boundary condition approaches can produce a single, globally consistent solution that does not allow contradictory timelines to exist. This notion of self-consistency is reminiscent of how closed time-like curves might be tamed by physical constraints. Whether the universe's laws inherently forbid paradox or whether it simply never arises in practice is an open question. But any credible theory of retrocausality must show how it avoids collapsing into paradoxical nonsense. The effect on scientific methodology is also worth noting. Most experimental setups are built on the assumption that the conditions we impose now or in the past determine what we will measure in the future, not the other way around. If, in principle, some future condition can shape the outcomes we see now, do we need to re-examine the logic of our experiments? Retrocausality advocates might say yes. Certain loopholes in quantum experiments, such as the free will or measurement independence loophole in Bell tests, could be explained if future measurement choices influence hidden variables in the past. This is extremely controversial, as the mainstream approach is to assume that experimenter choices are free and uncorrelated with hidden states that existed prior to measurement. But a retrocausal interpretation might say that we only think those choices are free, while in reality, the future measurement setting and the past hidden state are correlated through a time-symmetric dynamic. Skeptics argue that such theories violate common-sense causation or require conspiratorial fine-tuning. Advocates respond that if nature is fundamentally time-symmetric, it may not be conspiratorial at all, but simply a reflection of deeper laws that do not care which direction in time we label as forward. From a historical standpoint, retrocausality has lurked on the fringes for a while, but has occasionally surged into more serious discussion whenever quantum experiments produce results that seem to hint at retroactive influences. These moments usually spark interpretative battles, with mainstream consensus leaning on the no-signaling principle to reassure us that no real backward-in-time causation occurs. The alternative interpretations remain mathematically possible, but the standard view is that they are not necessary. Still, philosophers of physics point out that the simplest story of forward causation is not the only logically consistent narrative. Indeed, some have argued that time symmetry in fundamental physics plus certain quantum phenomena may be more elegantly explained by a retrocausal model. They lament that a forward causation bias is so deeply ingrained in our culture and scientific training that we reflexively discard or downplay these symmetrical approaches. In a broader cultural setting, retrocausality stirs imaginations, as it echoes timeless human fascinations with prophecy, time travel, and the idea that we might be destined by future events that are already fixed. Countless science fiction tales revolve around messages sent from the future that alter the past, or around individuals discovering they can influence present reality by glimpsing future knowledge. While real physics does not support these dramatic versions in any macroscopic sense, they would conflict with well-tested relativity principles and cause major paradoxes. The quantum and theoretical hints remain. They keep the door slightly ajar for the possibility that we do not fully understand time's architecture. Indeed, the notion of a timeless or all-at-once perspective is not alien to certain Eastern philosophies or mystical traditions that see the distinction between past and future as an illusion, or at least as something emergent rather than absolute. In that sense, retrocausality can function as a modern scientific angle on an ancient perspective that the linear flow of time might be an artifact of our finite viewpoint. Psychologically, the idea that the future might influence the past can unsettle our sense of agency, accountability, and even identity. We often define ourselves by the story of how the past led us to where we are, with the future open to our choices. A time-symmetric or retrocausal world suggests that the future is as fixed as the past in some higher-level sense. Our personal narrative might then become something like a path in a four-dimensional manifold, determined by boundary conditions at both ends. One can attempt a revisionist approach in which we still consider ourselves choosing, but that choice might reflect constraints from the future as well as from the past. Philosophically, one might adopt a stance akin to compatibilism, claiming that even in a block universe or a retrocausal model, we can define free will as the alignment of our actions with our internal states, without requiring the future to be undetermined. Others find that notion insufficient, feeling that if the future is in any sense already out there, our conscious experience of making a choice is illusory. Such debates have raged in the context of standard determinism. Retrocausality merely intensifies them by making the direction of determination go both ways. The story of retrocausality also intersects with the arrow of time problem in thermodynamics and statistical mechanics. The second law states that entropy increases, giving a direction to many processes in everyday life. If fundamental laws are time-symmetric, where does this irreversibility come from? Usually, the arrow is explained by low-entropy initial conditions at the Big Bang, meaning the universe started in an extraordinarily ordered state. Everything else that looks irreversible is a macroscopic emergent phenomenon of that improbable beginning. Retrocausality does not necessarily fix or eliminate the arrow of time. In fact, it might complicate it. If the future also plays a role, does that mean the universe ends in some equally improbable boundary condition? Some proposals for a two-headed arrow of time suggest that entropy might be low at both ends of the cosmic timeline, making the middle, our present epoch, the high-entropy region. That idea is highly speculative but illustrates how one might attempt to unify thermodynamics with a symmetrical block universe viewpoint. The notion is that the flow we experience might be a localized phenomenon in the middle of the block, with both ends forming boundary conditions that constrain the entire evolution. This approach remains on the cutting edge of cosmological and quantum gravity discussions, and no consensus has formed. Another dimension worth exploring is how retrocausality might surface, if at all, in emergent phenomena or complexity theory. Could advanced biological systems, for instance, exhibit behaviors that look teleological or end-driven, as though the future is guiding their development? Conventional evolutionary theory sees adaptation as a product of past selection pressures, not future goals. Yet some theorists flirt with the idea that time symmetry might allow advanced systems to appear teleological without supernatural forces. This is well outside the mainstream, but it shows how the retrocausal concept extends beyond quantum labs into broader scientific arenas, potentially rewriting how we conceive of evolution, complexity, or even consciousness. Skeptics retort that there is no evidence for such teleology in biology, and that any attempt to incorporate retrocausality in living systems must face enormous empirical hurdles. In the realm of actual laboratory tests, the bar for proving retrocausality is exceedingly high. One would need to isolate a phenomenon that unambiguously shows that future conditions alter present outcomes in a way that cannot be reduced to standard forward causation or correlated initial conditions. Attempts to demonstrate such an effect often run up against the principle that no information can be sent faster than light or backward in time, as established by relativity and consistent experimental evidence. If an effect can be explained by entanglement or quantum correlation without implying actual backward-in-time signals, then physicists default to that conservative explanation. For genuine retrocausality to be widely accepted, it would likely require a major revision of standard quantum theory or a new phenomenon that cannot be accounted for by conventional means. So far, no widely replicated experiment has forced the scientific community to adopt that revision. Despite the hurdles, retrocausality remains a topic of fascination and sporadic research, partly because quantum mechanics already defies many classical intuitions, so the idea that it might defy the arrow of time is not as outlandish as it would be in a purely classical framework. Moreover, the interplay of quantum theory and relativity remains incomplete, with no final theory of quantum gravity. Some deep unifying framework might, in principle, recast time in a manner that makes retrocausality not just a bizarre fringe possibility but a natural part of how the universe knits together. Whether that will be the case is uncertain. Many leading candidates in theoretical physics, such as string theory or loop quantum gravity, still treat causality as forward-directed, albeit with complex structures at the Planck scale. Others hold that a more radical rethinking of spacetime might be needed, in which time emerges from a timeless foundation of quantum information. The role of cause and effect in such a scenario is anyone's guess until more concrete models or data arise. For those compelled by the possibility of retrocausality, one frequent refrain is that it might explain certain quantum paradoxes more elegantly than conventional forward causal interpretations do. By allowing the wave function at time t2 to influence the system at time t1, or by letting the measurement boundary conditions at t2 shape the outcomes recorded at t1, we can produce a more straightforward account of phenomena like entanglement correlations or delayed choice experiments. The cost is that we relinquish the assumption that the past is wholly independent of the future. Philosophically, that is a hefty price. It means what we call the past is not, strictly speaking, locked in place before the future happens. But if one is comfortable with the block universe or with a fully time-symmetric fundamental law, the cost might be manageable, just another demonstration that human intuition about time is incomplete. In sum, retrocausality is a possibility that emerges from time-symmetric equations, certain interpretations of quantum mechanics, and advanced theoretical considerations in spacetime physics. It challenges the bedrock assumption that causes must always precede effects and that the past cannot be influenced by events that have yet to occur. While it remains unorthodox and controversial, it finds partial support in how quantum experiments can be described and in the block universe picture of relativity. Whether that support translates into actual, physically real backward influences or remains a mathematical relabeling of events is the crux of the interpretative debate. For mainstream science, the safe stance is that retrocausality is not required for explaining data and that it risks reintroducing paradox. Nonetheless, the door is not fully closed. The underlying laws of physics are more symmetrical than our everyday experience would suggest, and the arrow of time is often seen as an emergent phenomenon rather than a fundamental one. If it truly emerges from boundary conditions or from thermodynamic constraints, one might discover that nature's deeper substrate does not care which direction is future or past, and that in special circumstances, phenomena might reflect influences we would label retrocausal. No matter how the debate evolves, retrocausality brings us face to face with the biggest mysteries about time. Our psychology, our science, and our moral frameworks are built on the premise that what's done is done, that the future is an undetermined realm of possibility. Yet, if the future somehow affects the past, then that division may be an illusion. Instead, events across the entire timeline might cohere in a single tapestry, consistent from start to finish and from finish to start. If so, the puzzle is not how the future causes the past in a linear sense, but rather how the universe enforces consistency across a dimension we call time. Such a view might not change how we live day to day, but it would profoundly shift our metaphysical understanding of existence, dethroning the idea that the past is fixed while the future is open, and hinting that everything that ever happens is part of a grand, self-consistent structure stretching from alpha to omega. Perhaps, then, our classical sense of forward-flowing cause and effect is a convenience of our vantage point, a local manifestation of thermodynamic and cognitive processes that interpret the world in one temporal direction. Retrocausality would remind us that nature, at its core, might well be impartial to that direction, weaving connections from later to earlier moments as seamlessly as from earlier to later, forging a universe far more subtle, and perhaps far more profound, than our linear instincts can comfortably fathom. The Mandela Effect, it begins innocuously enough. A momentary confusion over a brand logo, a movie line, or a historical event. Perhaps you recall certain details with unwavering confidence, only to discover, upon checking, that the facts differ from your memory. Even more disconcerting, you find that large numbers of people share the exact same misrecollection. The phenomenon in which widespread groups of individuals exhibit a collective false memory has come to be known as the Mandela Effect, a term that captures both the intriguing nature of the phenomenon and the deep sense of cognitive dislocation it can induce. Its name references an iconic example, the collective recollection held by many that Nelson Mandela died in prison during the 1980s, decades before his real passing in 2013. When confronted with archival reality, these individuals describe intense disbelief, claiming they clearly remember news footage or discussions of his funeral long before it actually happened. Such experiences prompt unsettling questions about the reliability of memory, the malleability of collective narratives, and even the consistency of reality itself. The phrase Mandela Effect was coined by writer and paranormal researcher Fiona Broome, who recounted her own astonishment at learning that Mandela was alive and well in the early 21st century. She discovered that this misrecollection was widespread, prompting her to speculate on alternate realities or merged timelines. Since then, the concept has expanded to encompass a vast array of memory discrepancies, some trivial, some more consequential, forming a swirling tapestry of curiosity, confusion, and occasionally conspiratorial speculation. While psychologists and neuroscientists often attribute such phenomena to the reconstructive nature of human memory, popular culture has embraced more dramatic explanations, including parallel universes, quantum-level timeline shifts, or glitches in a simulated reality. Each proposed explanation offers a different window into how we understand collective perception, mass psychology, and the fundamental nature of the past. The memory illusions at the heart of the Mandela Effect manifest in countless popular examples. The children's book and cartoon series, The Berenstain Bears, is frequently recalled as the Berenstein Bears, with many adults insisting they vividly remember the spelling with an E. Others recall the brand name Fruit of the Loom, featuring a cornucopia in its logo, even though official archives show no such cornucopia ever existed. Another variant centers on lines from well-known movies, such as Luke, I am your father from Star Wars, the actual line being, no, I am your father, or the Disney film Snow White, which most people remember referencing mirror, mirror on the wall, while the earliest version of that line says, magic mirror on the wall. The list extends to brand names like Kit Kat, which some recall having a hyphen, Kit Kat, that is not actually present, or Febreze, which many swear was spelled Febreze, with an extra E. These mismatches between personal recollection and recorded reality can be jarring, especially when one realizes that hordes of other people share the same recollection. That sense of communal error can feel uncanny, as if one has stepped into a momentary twilight zone where the stable bedrock of what happened is no longer so firm. Although mainstream scientific consensus explains such events via the constructive and fallible nature of memory, believers or enthusiasts see them as potential evidence of something more profound. Some interpret these memory discrepancies as cosmic or quantum-level anomalies, evidence that timelines have shifted or merged, leaving a portion of the population with lingering recollections from an alternate timeline. Others suggest that advanced technologies might have manipulated reality, or that we live in a simulation that occasionally patches or updates details, leaving behind partial echoes of the previous version in people's minds. While such theories remain far outside orthodox science, they illustrate the powerful emotional resonance the Mandela Effect can have, especially in an era where information and misinformation circulates rapidly and collective experiences can be documented and compared on a global scale with unprecedented ease. To appreciate the core issues, it is essential to delve into how memory operates. Human memory is not like a video recording that can be replayed on demand. Rather, memory is reconstructive. Each time we recall an event, we piece it together from various fragments of sensory data, emotional impressions, and narrative context. This process is susceptible to distortion and suggestion. If a friend or article insists that a brand name was spelled a certain way, our recollection can morph, especially if we are vaguely familiar with the brand but never paid hyperclose attention to the packaging. Over time, repeated retrieval and social reinforcement can cement a false memory with extraordinary conviction. This phenomenon is known in psychology as the misinformation effect, where people can strongly incorporate incorrect details into their recollections after exposure to misleading information. Furthermore, the same processes that shape individual recall can become amplified in group settings. When entire communities share stories, the collective memory can stabilize around certain inaccuracies, giving rise to widely believed illusions. The Mandela Effect, from a psychological standpoint, is a large-scale manifestation of these reconstructive tendencies, magnified by social and cultural forces. Yet, for many who experience the Mandela Effect firsthand, psychological explanations can feel unsatisfying. They argue that while memory biases might account for minor confusions, the intensity and specificity of certain recollections go beyond casual forgetfulness or social suggestion. In the Mandela example, for instance, many people report vivid mental images of news coverage or personal conversations about his funeral. The discrepancy between that level of detail and the actual timeline is difficult for them to attribute solely to memory quirks. This is where the concept of parallel universes or timeline shifts enters the picture. According to this line of thought, reality may not be a single, unbroken timeline, but rather a dynamic web of parallel possibilities. At some juncture, a portion of the population might have inhabited a timeline where Nelson Mandela died in prison in the 1980s, while others were in a timeline consistent with his survival until 2013. A subsequent merging of these timelines would leave a fraction of people with residual memories that no longer match the official historical record. While no physicist would accept such an explanation without monumental evidence, parallels with certain interpretations of quantum mechanics feed the imaginations of those searching for an otherworldly cause. Quantum theory, particularly in the many worlds interpretation, does postulate branching timelines at the micro level for every possible outcome of a quantum event. However, bridging that principle into large-scale historical divergences and then reconverging them remains purely speculative and is generally dismissed in mainstream science. Nonetheless, the dreamlike notion that we might harbor memories from an alternate reality remains an alluring piece of modern folklore, proliferating through internet forums and YouTube channels dedicated to evidence of timeline hops. To critics, this is merely an updated version of supernatural or paranormal beliefs, now cloaked in pseudo-quantum language. But to believers, it is a serious possibility that resonates with their lived sense of confusion and discrepancy. Another exotic explanation is the so-called simulation hypothesis, which posits that our reality is a computational construct akin to a massive video game, possibly run by advanced beings or future humans. In such a simulation, the operators might occasionally alter parameters or correct an inconsistency, inadvertently leaving partial traces of the old data in people's memories. The Mandela Effect in this framework is relabeled as a glitch in the matrix, a minor error in an otherwise seamless program. The conceptual jump from memory illusions to a cosmic-scale simulation is enormous, and again, not taken seriously by empirical researchers, yet it captures the imagination, especially in a digital era where the line between real and virtual can already feel porous. If we accept that modern computers can simulate increasingly lifelike virtual worlds, some argue that future or external intelligences with colossal computational power could simulate entire historical epochs, complete with inhabitants who do not realize they are part of a program. A patch or software update to correct an in-simulation error might then cause the reality to shift slightly, messing up small details like brand spellings or historical events. But why? Skeptics might ask, would the simulators only glitch on trivial details like the spelling of Berenstain, or whether a cartoon character had a tail? Those committed to a simulation viewpoint sometimes respond that these are just side effects or minor oversights. If the simulators are making bigger structural changes to reality, the only noticeable differences might be small, incidental items or events that not everyone focuses on. Another interpretation is that the simulators intentionally leave a few anomalies so that the more inquisitive inhabitants might suspect the truth. Critics find such reasoning more reminiscent of science fiction plot devices than robust theory. Regardless, its popularity highlights the cultural climate in which the Mandela Effect thrives. An era steeped in digital illusions, conspiracy theories, and fascination with the boundaries of consensus reality. Among the less dramatic but more empirically grounded lines of thought is the idea that the internet age amplifies shared false memories in a manner unprecedented in human history. Decades ago, a person might vaguely recall a brand name or movie quote incorrectly, but that mistake would remain personal or confined to a small social circle. Today, a single prompt on social media can spark a viral conversation, revealing that thousands of others share the same misrecollection. The resulting phenomenon can feel like a mass epiphany. Wait, we all remember this detail that never actually happened. This fosters an illusion of an alternate reality or timeline slip. In truth, the internet simply reveals how widespread certain memory distortions can be and how swiftly they can self-organize into a collective narrative. The intense emotional reactions, combined with compelling anecdotes, make the phenomenon appear more mysterious than it might be if one examined each case on its individual merits, where the plausible psychological mechanisms of false recall and social reinforcement stand as obvious culprits. To understand the Mandela effect more deeply, it helps to explore the cognitive factors that drive false collective memories. One factor is confabulation, where the brain fills memory gaps with plausible details drawn from context, cultural tropes, or semantic associations. If, for instance, one grew up glancing at the Berenstain Bears books in passing, the spelling Berenstein might align better with common surname patterns like Einstein. Over time, that slight assumption becomes embedded, and any contradictory evidence is overlooked. Another factor is the power of suggestion. Once a viral social media post claims, "Hey, do you remember the Berenstain Bears?" Well, guess what? It's actually spelled Berenstain. Individuals who see it might adopt that memory as if they had it all along, creating a retrospective sense of having always spelled it with an E. Confirmation bias also plays a role, as people who prefer the fascinating "we've shifted realities" narrative will more eagerly gather examples that support it and ignore the many mundane instances where memory does not produce such illusions. In a broader psychological sense, the Mandela effect demonstrates that memory is inherently reconstructive and social. We often rely on external references, family anecdotes, mass media, popular culture, to scaffold our recollections. Because these references can be inaccurate or partially fictional, errors propagate easily. The phenomenon is not unlike the creation of urban legends or the game of telephone, in which a piece of information is whispered from person to person and mutates along the way. With the Mandela effect, the mutation involves a mismatch between a culturally reinforced recollection and the recorded or verifiable facts. In earlier times, such collective illusions would have emerged and dissipated more slowly, perhaps existing as local legends. Now, digital media allows them to crystallize into robust, widespread phenomena almost overnight. The emotional impact is amplified because these illusions challenge something so personal as our memory, a faculty we trust intimately to record our experiences and anchor our sense of identity. The name itself, Mandela Effect, is often used interchangeably to refer to any shared false memory, though originally it was tied specifically to the recollection of Nelson Mandela's premature death. That example is compelling because it deals with a major historical figure, making the misremembered funeral or coverage more dramatic than, say, a brand logo. Why Mandela? Some speculate that news stories about his lengthy imprisonment and activism might have merged in some people's minds with reports about other anti-apartheid activists who died in custody, or even with the prior, real coverage of Steve Biko, whose death in prison in the 1970s was a major event. Alternatively, the general sense that Mandela was ill during parts of his captivity and might not survive could have embedded a near certainty of his death among certain segments of the public. Once a few people articulated this recollection, it spread virally, each person's memory reinforcing the others, forging a newly minted group myth of sorts. This social reinforcement dynamic raises the question: how do we confirm the authenticity of any memory that cannot be verified through multiple independent sources? That question edges into broader philosophical territory. Some radical interpretations treat the Mandela effect as evidence that historical facts themselves might be mutable or that reality is constantly being edited, an outgrowth of postmodern skepticism about the objectivity of truth. This stance can be dangerous if taken too far, as it can feed into conspiratorial thinking where any contradictory evidence is cast as part of the glitch or cover-up. The more plausible stance remains that we rely on objective records, journals, photographic and video documentation, and multiple eyewitness accounts with consistent testimony. In the case of the alleged funeral of Mandela in the 1980s, no historical trace or consistent third-party documentation supports it. Our best inference is that the memory is erroneous. Understanding that memory illusions are more frequent and convincing than we might realize is the heart of the psychological approach to the Mandela effect. One might wonder why certain false memories become so widespread. Why do some illusions, such as Berenstain Bears, catch fire and become mass phenomena, while others remain obscure or fade away? The answer lies partly in how intimately these items are woven into popular culture, particularly childhood culture. Children's books, cereal boxes, cartoons, and movie quotes are repeated so often that they become etched in collective consciousness, albeit sometimes incorrectly. Another factor is how easy it is to mistake or slightly alter these items. Subtle differences in spelling, Berenstain versus Berenstein, Looney Tunes versus Looney Tunes, or phrasing, "No, I am your father" versus "Luke, I am your father," slip through the cracks of attention, especially for casual observers. Over time, the collective mind normalizes the more expected or logical pattern, thereby embedding a misperception. The phenomenon intensifies once the difference is publicly pointed out. Did you know it's actually spelled Berenstain, not Berenstein? Then a wave of people respond, "No way, that's impossible. I clearly remember it with an E." The emotional dissonance that arises feeds further viral spread. Though some remain content to attribute the Mandela effect to the quirks of memory, others seek deeper significance. The subculture of reality shifting has gained momentum online, with people sharing personal anecdotes of noticing other subtle changes in their environment, street names, store layouts, or family recollections that no one else seems to confirm. They interpret these micro-changes as ongoing evidence that we are moving between parallel timelines. While mainstream psychology would see such beliefs as likely misinterpretations of normal memory fallibility, the phenomenon underscores how these illusions can become integrated into a broader worldview that challenges linear, stable conceptions of reality. In this sense, the Mandela effect aligns with other mind-bending ideas in popular culture: simulation theory, quantum weirdness, UFO conspiracies, digital glitch lore, offering a romantic sense that the everyday world might hide deeper mysteries or illusions. This speaks to a universal human desire for the uncanny or the transcendent in an era dominated by rationalistic explanations. Another angle worth examining is the potential interplay between the Mandela effect and social media algorithms. Platforms like TikTok, YouTube, or Reddit often reward content that provokes strong emotional reactions: disbelief, amazement, curiosity. Posts that highlight a supposed Mandela effect, "Wait, do you remember this brand from your childhood?" can easily go viral, generating massive engagement. Such virality not only spreads the specific instance, but also encourages others to post their own discoveries. This feedback loop can create a thriving ecosystem of content devoted to exploring or promoting new Mandela effect examples. Each new wave of illusions, however small, can gain traction if it strikes a chord with enough users. The sheer connectivity of modern life thus amplifies and normalizes phenomena that might once have been obscure curiosities. Whether one interprets this as a modern mania or a testament to collective creativity depends on perspective, but it certainly demonstrates the potency of digital networks in shaping public consciousness. At the same time, mainstream media occasionally covers the Mandela effect, often in lighthearted or sensational pieces. Are you in the wrong timeline? Check out these 10 examples. Such coverage can further embed the concept in popular discourse, making it less likely that people dismiss it as mere psychological error. The more it is recognized as a cultural phenomenon, the more it gains perceived legitimacy, at least as a subject of intrigue. Meanwhile, academics in psychology and neuroscience see the conversation as an opportunity to educate the public about memory's malleability. From their vantage, the proliferation of these illusions is a textbook example of how easily memory can be distorted, especially when validated by collective recognition. By highlighting the Mandela effect in courses, interviews, and publications, they hope to steer the conversation away from mystification and toward informed appreciation of the mind's complexities. Beneath these debates, there is a deeper existential chord. Many who resonate with the Mandela Effect describe a sense that reality itself is fluid or that their own sense of grounding has been shaken. Realizing that something you remember with crystal clarity never happened can be existentially disorienting, prompting a reevaluation of how we construct personal histories and identities. On a personal scale, one might ask, if I got this wrong, what else might I be misremembering? Could my entire childhood be full of illusions I never questioned? On a collective scale, it fosters a sense that the official record might not be as unassailable as we assume. Mistrust in mainstream narratives or in the stability of the shared world can flourish in such an environment, which in turn can bleed into more harmful conspiracy theories if left unchecked. The ripple effects of memory illusions can thus shape how groups approach history, evidence, and communal consensus. From a strictly empirical stance, it is crucial to note that many alleged Mandela Effect examples can be debunked or contextualized. For instance, some historical claims that are misremembered by thousands might have rational explanations. For example, a product line may indeed have changed its packaging or name at some point, leading to confusion about old versus new versions. Or media references that parroted or misquoted a line, like mirror, mirror on the wall, in comedic sketches or derivative works, might overshadow the original text, thus lodging a corrupted version in mass consciousness. In other situations, official brand stylizations might appear in different forms in different regions or at different times, producing real discrepancies that feed the sense of confusion. Sorting through each case typically reveals mundane reasons for why so many people might recall a detail incorrectly, though the aggregated effect still feels uncanny when presented in a single list. Ultimately, no single case conclusively proves a timeline shift or parallel universe. Each can be explained via natural cognitive and cultural processes. However, the emotional resonance arises from the cumulative sense that our collective memory can be so convincingly at odds with the documented facts. Nevertheless, the conversation refuses to die out, in part because of the Internet's capacity to keep these discussions alive and evolving. As soon as one example is explained or debunked, a new one surfaces, reigniting the sense of wonder or confusion. Some might see this cycle as a reflection of modern society's appetite for viral mysteries, an appetite fed by an online infrastructure built on hype and rapid information exchange. Others might interpret it as a deeper philosophical craving, a longing to find cracks in the surface of ordinary life that hint at grand metaphysical truths. Either way, the Mandela Effect occupies a niche at the intersection of pop culture, cognitive science, and borderline mystical speculation. It teaches lessons about how memory and reality interact, how easily collective misbelief can form, and how quickly it can spread in a digitally connected age. To place the Mandela Effect in a historical context, one could draw parallels to earlier mass illusions or moral panics. Instances of shared misremembering have likely happened for centuries, albeit with different subject matter. Perhaps entire communities once recalled religious events or local legends in ways that diverged from earlier accounts, attributing it to divine or supernatural forces. Folklorists note that collective memory is shaped by storytelling, and over generations, these narratives can shift drastically. The difference in the 21st century is the scale, speed, and global reach with which such illusions can travel, as well as the archiving capabilities of digital media. When you can instantly check thousands of archive sources, official brand documents, or historical records, you either confirm the mismatch or discover it never existed. Both outcomes can intensify the phenomenon. It either proves the timeline changed or reveals a mass mental error, depending on one's interpretive lens. Another dimension worth pondering is the line between harmless curiosity and more troubling forms of memory distortion. For most people, the Mandela Effect is a playful or fascinating quirk. Isn't it weird that we all remember it this way? But in more serious contexts, such as eyewitness testimony in court cases, collective false memories can have real consequences. The possibility that entire groups could misremember key details is a reminder that memory is not the bedrock of truth we might wish it to be. Historically, eyewitness misidentifications have led to wrongful convictions, and the power of suggestion can shape testimonies in profound ways. While that is not typically framed as part of the Mandela Effect, it underscores the same fundamental principle. Memory is neither static nor immune to social influence. The difference is that in everyday pop culture matters like brand names or movie quotes, the stakes are low, so we can indulge in cosmic or comedic speculation without serious harm, unless it fosters a broader mindset of rejecting all evidence-based reality. Still, for some individuals, discovering the Mandela Effect can be a gateway into deeper epistemological introspection. They may come to question how they know what they know, or how they can trust collective narratives about history, science, or personal experiences. In the best cases, this introspection leads to a more critical, open-minded approach, acknowledging the need for verification and the fallibility of recollection. In the worst cases, it descends into conspiratorial thinking that rejects all official records as manipulated, ironically risking an even more distorted worldview. Which path emerges often depends on broader social and psychological factors, including education, community norms, and personal predispositions toward skepticism or credulity. At a meta level, the Mandela Effect also highlights the fluidity of popular culture itself. Jokes, references, memes, and half-remembered bits from decades past swirl together, forming a collective tapestry that is constantly rewritten. Even if we recorded every detail in real time, the retrieval of these details is shaped by context and subjective interpretation. With each retelling, certain parts become enshrined in mass memory, while others fade or mutate. The result is a shared cultural consciousness that is dynamic, collaborative, and occasionally prone to group illusions that feel deeply real. We see parallels in debates over historical events like the design of certain cartoon characters or the precise wording of famous speeches. The lines between primary sources, derivative works, and parodies blur in memory, forging collectively endorsed errors that can persist for years or decades. In the final analysis, the phenomenon commonly labeled as the Mandela Effect exemplifies how delicate the link between memory and reality can be, and how communal that link has become in a hyper-connected era. Our recollections, individually and collectively, are shaped by many influences. Personal biases, incomplete attention, social cues, cultural references, repeated retellings, parodies, brand evolutions, and more. Psychologically, it is a testament to how our brains strive to organize information, fill in gaps, and maintain coherent narratives. Sociologically, it reveals how easily entire communities can converge on false recollections once social media or other channels provide a feedback loop of validation. Theoretically, it has inspired a swirl of speculative metaphysics, parallel universes, simulated realities, timeline merges, that, while lacking empirical support, speak to a powerful longing for cosmic wonder in the face of mundane explanations. One might see in this swirling discourse both a warning about the fragility of evidence-based consensus and a celebration of how imaginative and flexible human cognition can be. Does the Mandela Effect prove that timelines are fluid, or that we inhabit a glitchy simulation? Mainstream science answers with a resounding probably not, pointing to the well-understood psychological and cultural mechanisms behind false memory formation. Yet it is undeniable that for many, encountering these examples is a surreal experience, prompting a radical reconsideration of how we piece together a shared sense of the past. That sense of collective wonder or disorientation might be the real legacy of the Mandela Effect in popular culture. A reminder that our everyday certainty rests on shifting sands of memory, held together by communal storytelling. Perhaps that is not so different from older mythic traditions, which wove communal narratives that shaped entire societies, only to be replaced or revised by subsequent generations. Today, we witness it in real time as brand spellings or movie lines become the subject of viral mass illusions, sparking ephemeral yet potent feelings that we have glimpsed a crack in the matrix. In a broader philosophical or existential sense, the fact that a widespread false memory can garner so much attention underscores the fragility of knowledge. It is tempting to believe that our personal recollections are authoritative. After all, we lived through them. But the Mandela Effect underscores that living memory is no guarantee of accuracy. Our minds are storytellers, weaving plausible versions of events that serve to preserve coherence rather than strict fidelity. On the scale of an entire population, that storytelling function can yield cultural or historical illusions that become entrenched. If we can collectively misremember something as trivial as a brand name or a cartoon catchphrase, could we not also misremember or distort more critical narratives? That question, at times, has uneasy implications for how we track truth in political, social, and historical domains. Indeed, some might see in the Mandela Effect an object lesson in how easily societies can slip into consensus around misinformation, a phenomenon that extends beyond brand names to shape real-world policy debates, ideological movements, and worldviews. Yet, for all its potential seriousness, the Mandela Effect often remains a source of playful curiosity. Many participants in online forums share stories with a sense of wonder rather than dread. They joke about living in the Berenstain timeline, or express mock frustration that they cannot jump back to the Stein dimension. The whimsy might be a coping strategy, an outlet to process the shock that memory can betray us so profoundly. Others turn it into a form of creative expression, producing art, fiction, or comedic sketches that revolve around the idea of memory shifts or timeline merges. It can thus function as a small cultural movement that channels confusion into communal bonding, a shared acceptance that not everything in our heads lines up with external fact. Whether one remains partial to psychological, sociological, or paranormal explanations, the ubiquity of the Mandela Effect in popular culture seems unlikely to fade. New discoveries will keep cropping up, fueling social media feeds and dinner party conversations. The underlying dynamic, collective misrecall validated by communal discovery has become a fixture of the digital age. With each iteration, some individuals may step further into radical speculation about altered realities, while others refine their understanding of how memory actually works. In that tension lies the enduring fascination with the Mandela Effect. It stands at the crossroads of the ordinary and the extraordinary, the scientific and the mystical, the personal and the collective. It highlights the interplay between a rapidly shifting media landscape and the deep-seated human need to find patterns, tell stories, and anchor ourselves in a secure sense of what happened. Thus, the Mandela Effect is, at once, a testament to the elasticity of memory and a commentary on the illusions that can arise when memory is shared, shaped, and amplified on a mass scale. Whether one interprets it as a trivial quirk, a sign of cosmic weirdness, or a commentary on the postmodern instability of facts, it cannot be denied that it has tapped into a collective nerve. In doing so, it underscores a perennial truth about human cognition. Our recollections and beliefs are interwoven with social narratives and cultural frameworks. We trust our memories to anchor us in reality, yet they are surprisingly prone to drift, shaped by suggestion, context, and pattern recognition. The Mandela Effect is less about parallel universes and more about the ephemeral boundaries between personal perception and communal consensus. It is less about proof of cosmic glitchiness and more about how we negotiate truth in an age where information and misinformation swirl together in a global conversation. Ultimately, if there is a unifying lesson, it is one of humility in the face of our mental processes. Recognizing that large groups can confidently share an incorrect recollection invites us to tread lightly when we rely on memory, our own or others, for absolute certainty. It nudges us to consult external evidence, remain open to correction, and keep in mind the manifold ways illusions of recollection can arise. For those who crave a dash of mystery, the Mandela Effect offers a modern mythos, an invitation to wonder whether reality might be more malleable than we assumed. For those who value grounded explanations, it stands as a demonstration of the fascinating intricacies of the human mind. In both regards, it reveals that the line between the truth of what happened and the stories we tell about it is never as clear-cut as we might wish, reminding us that, collectively, we are storytellers as much as we are observers of an objective world. And as long as that remains the case, phenomena like the Mandela Effect will continue to captivate and perplex, beckoning us to question how certain we can really be about the simplest details of the past. The zero-point solipsism, what if every notion you hold dear, including the sense of your own presence, is nothing more than a shimmering mirage. Philosophers have wrestled for centuries with solipsism, the view that only one's mind is certain to exist, but a yet more radical possibility. Here called zero-point solipsism, pushes that stance to a realm so extreme that even the I in I think, therefore I am collapses. This essay proposes to probe in excruciating detail that unsettling possibility, that not only might the external world be an illusion, but you, the observer, are just as illusory. In other words, there is no anchor of existence, no guaranteed vantage point from which to declare anything real, no vantage point, even to declare itself real. The basic form of traditional solipsism suggests that all immediate sensory and mental experiences might be figments of a single consciousness. Everything, trees, other people, distant galaxies, historical events, you name it, could exist only insofar as one mind perceives them. In that scenario, although external objects and beings may be illusions, the solipsist can still retreat to the certainty that a perceiving subject must exist. The statement, I think, therefore I am, Descartes cogito ergo sum, has often been treated as an unassailable fortress of knowledge. After all, to doubt one's own existence implies that one is thinking, and thus something must be doing the doubting. Yet zero-point solipsism annihilates this last refuge. It wonders aloud, what if the doubter itself is an illusion? What if the very process of thinking is ephemeral, lacking a genuine substrate, lacking a genuine thinker in any real sense? If that is the case, then the usual recourse cogito ergo sum becomes suspect. The lines between subject and object blur into pure emptiness. All appearances of an external world, of a personal mind, are illusions inside illusions with no stable vantage point behind them. No small part of the difficulty in discussing zero-point solipsism is that language itself presupposes a speaker or a writer, as someone doing the analyzing and presumably as someone else reading or listening. But if the theory is taken seriously, both the author and the audience might be illusions, ephemeral constructs that do not truly exist. The words on this page, if indeed you are reading them, might be conjured in a non-existent mind that simultaneously does not exist in any real sense. This verges on paradox. How can illusions generate illusions, and how do we parse the meaning of statements when neither the producer nor the consumer of meaning can be said to exist at all? Yet such is the power of zero-point solipsism. It forces us to confront the possibility that the entire conceptual apparatus by which we attempt to explain reality stands on quicksand. Traditional solipsism is already radical enough to be deemed a philosophical dead end by most thinkers, because it cannot be disproved but offers little practical leverage. However, it does maintain a safe harbor in the self. If the sense data and everything else is questionable, at least the immediate presence of a thinking entity is not. Or so it is claimed. Zero-point solipsism says, no, that too might be an illusion. In a sense, it loops around to a stance even more radical than classical skepticism. Skepticism, in normal usage, acknowledges that we cannot be sure about external objects or other minds. But zero-point solipsism says that not even the skeptic's vantage is stable. Even the concept of doubting becomes a ghostly phenomenon with no assured doubter behind it. Such a notion resonates in interesting ways with certain strands of Eastern mysticism, particularly those that suggest the self is a construct or that the ultimate nature of reality is emptiness. In the West, though, philosophers have typically begun from a default assumption that a subject must exist to do the perceiving, even if everything else is uncertain. Zero-point solipsism appends that assumption, proposing that the subject itself could be a phenomenon with no real essence. Some strands of Zen or Advaita Vedanta do hint at something similar, that the I might be an illusion, that consciousness itself might be ephemeral or universal. But zero-point solipsism is not necessarily about unity with a cosmic ground of being. It is about a total vacuum, a swirling illusion with no anchor in any dimension. Even if certain Eastern traditions speak of emptiness or no self, they often do so in the context of a deeper, abiding reality or consciousness, whereas zero-point solipsism postulates that depth itself might be an illusion, leaving literally nothing at all. At first glance, one might wonder how to even conceive of such a position. If truly nothing exists, or if every vantage point is ephemeral, how do illusions appear in the first place? Typically, illusions appear to or within something, no matter how ephemeral. Yet the zero-point solipsist stance challenges that assumption. Illusions might just appear, spontaneously, to no one, signifying nothing. It is reminiscent of a statement like thoughts without a thinker, extended into the realm of all phenomena. Everything that occurs might be an unowned phenomenon, swirling in a void. The observer and the observed co-arise, but neither side possesses any genuine reality or identity. This is a profoundly destabilizing viewpoint that can, for many, evoke a sense of existential vertigo. Where do we place ourselves if even the notion of placing ourselves is an illusion? One might see the seeds of this in certain radical readings of Hume's bundle theory. David Hume famously argued that the self is nothing but a bundle of perceptions with no real unity behind them. Usually, philosophers interpret Hume as demolishing the notion of a persisting personal identity. But there is still a bundle, a cluster of perceptions, even if they lack a unifying self. Zero-point solipsism goes a step further, suggesting that not only is the self absent, but the entire notion of perceptions might be an ephemeral story. One might then retort, whose story is it? Who is perceiving the illusions? The zero-point viewpoint says, no one, not even illusions themselves. The entire question might be ill-formed, emerging from the assumption that illusions require a perceiver. If that assumption is false, illusions can exist in an unowned, ungrounded manner. Another way to phrase it, illusions do not require a subject any more than illusions require an external object. They just are. But if illusions just are, we have no vantage from which to declare them illusions, so the entire scenario becomes self-voiding. Precisely. That is why it is zero-point. No vantage, no anchor, no reality. We can attempt to compare zero-point solipsism with standard philosophical categories. Realism contends that an external world exists independently of the mind. Idealism claims that reality is mental, with the mind or mind-like substance being the fundamental substrate. Solipsism, in a narrower sense, contends that only one mind or self can be known to exist, or that only that mind is real. Zero-point solipsism leaps beyond. Not only is the external world suspect, but the mind or self itself might be illusory. Indeed, it posits that there might be no realness at any level, material, mental, or otherwise. One might label this as a form of radical illusionism or ultimate nihilism. If illusions exist but are illusions to no one, the concept of existence itself might lose traction. Language breaks down because to exist typically implies to exist in some manner or medium, but zero-point solipsism might disavow any mediums or vantage points. It is reminiscent of a universe that is nothing disguised as something, except even disguised might imply some trickster force or process that is likewise absent. One line of critique is that such a theory, if it is a theory at all, cannot be meaningfully articulated. The moment you propose there is nothing real, not even the I who says so, you have used language as if you are a person making a claim. The zero-point stance can only gesture at a radical dissolution that is, in principle, unspeakable. In practice, it becomes a kind of conceptual finger pointing to an abyss that swallows even the pointer. Some might argue that it is less a theory to be believed and more a philosophical or spiritual insight to be glimpsed, like a Zen koan that is meant to break the mind out of its typical subject-object model. If that is the case, the attempt to write 20,000 words about zero-point solipsism is ironically contradictory, turning it into an object of intellectual discourse, which is precisely what the stance undermines. This tension underlies any serious engagement with extreme skepticism. Can we truly talk about that which denies the possibility of talking? Despite these conceptual tangles, we can still analyze the consequences of zero-point solipsism, at least from a vantage that pretends to exist for the sake of argument. Suppose one tries to live as though zero-point solipsism were correct. Then nothing is real, including the personal sense of self. In that scenario, moral responsibility, planning, rational thought, or even the concept of illusions themselves might unravel. Some might see parallels with a meltdown of all normal categories. It is beyond moral relativism, beyond practical concerns, beyond even the impetus to do anything. Yet, in an odd sense, one could also say that the illusions continue to do their thing. The body illusion might get up and go to work. The illusions of hunger might cause illusions of eating. The illusions of conversation might carry on. All is ephemeral, ungrounded, and lacking a vantage point. But to whom is it ephemeral? No one. The illusions just occur. This viewpoint renders everything unstoppable and unstoppable by no one. It does not matter, from a zero-point perspective, that there is no real impetus or reason behind the illusions. They simply appear. Or, more precisely, illusions non-appear, because appearance might also imply a vantage from which they appear. Language fails again. Such radical skepticism is not entirely unknown in philosophical tradition. Some compare it to the apex of Pyrrhonism, an ancient Greek school that withheld assent from all beliefs, even the proposition that a self or a vantage point must exist. Although Pyrrhonists typically allowed for practical living by following appearances, they also recognized that asserting any claim about the ultimate nature of reality was suspect. Zero-point solipsism is, in a way, an extreme extension of that. Even the idea "I must exist to doubt" is a claim that might be suspect. So, from a Pyrrhonist angle, one might say that zero-point solipsism is simply the consistent outcome of unrelenting doubt. You cannot ground anything, so the final posture is not even "I do not know." But there is no I to not know and no knowledge to be had. An interesting question arises. If one truly embraces zero-point solipsism, does it produce a kind of mental or spiritual liberation, or does it result in despair? In typical solipsism, one might feel lonely or trapped. I alone exist. All else is me or illusory. But in zero-point solipsism, even that sense of I cannot stand. The result might be an extreme emptiness that is beyond lonely. There is no subject to be lonely, nor an other to be separate from. Can be read as ultimate freedom or ultimate nullification, depending on your vantage. Except, of course, vantage is also suspect. The discussion here, ironically, must use vantage-based language to parse the notion. Some might find this destructive of the possibility of meaning, while others might find it reminiscent of certain non-dualist spiritual experiences, where the sense of a personal agent dissolves. The difference is that in many mystical experiences, the dissolution of self reveals a deeper cosmic consciousness or universal being, whereas zero-point solipsism claims there might be no cosmic or universal anything, no deeper consciousness behind the illusions. It is a pure void. We might compare this to a difference between mystical no-self in a tradition like Buddhism and zero-point solipsism. Buddhism often states no-self with the caveat that phenomena still arise according to dependent origination, and that one can be liberated by seeing the emptiness of self and phenomena. But in Buddhism, even if phenomena are empty, the system of dependent origination is typically considered real in some pragmatic sense, and the awakened consciousness can see through illusions from a vantage of enlightened mind. Zero-point solipsism discards that vantage as well. No awakened mind, no illusions that stand apart from a deeper truth, no underlying suchness, just an ephemeral swirl with no vantage. If that swirl is recognized by no one, is it recognized at all? Possibly not. This is precisely why the stance is so disorienting. Even the concept of disorientation might be a leftover from the vantage-based thinking it eliminates. We can also approach zero-point solipsism from the standpoint of mainstream epistemology, which typically tries to ground knowledge in something certain, or at least in coherent structures. Descartes offered the certainty of "I think, therefore I am," yet zero-point solipsism says that even that is not guaranteed. Another approach is to say knowledge arises from reliable processes anchored in external reality, but zero-point solipsism denies any external reality or an internal subject. So knowledge has nowhere to stand. The question then is zero-point solipsism a legitimate epistemological stance, or is it simply a reductio ad absurdum that shows the folly of pushing skepticism too far? Many philosophers might argue the latter. Zero-point solipsism is so extreme that it is not workable as an epistemology. But from the perspective of consistent radical doubt, it cannot be logically refuted either, because any attempt to refute it uses vantage-based language. If the vantage does not exist, that refutation crumbles or cannot even begin. One might say the position is immune to refutation but also incapable of confirmation. It is an unlocatable stance, if stance is the right word. Another angle arises when we consider illusions. Usually, illusions exist for a subject who is being deceived, or we interpret illusions as misrepresentations of reality. Zero-point solipsism could be described as an illusion of illusions, where not only is there no true reality, there is no subject that could be said to be deceived. One might wonder if the word illusion even retains meaning in such a context. Typically, illusions are contrasted with something real, But if everything is illusory, including the vantage from which illusions are identified, we have no grounds for that contrast. This can lead to conceptual meltdown, where we might say that zero-point solipsism is not even an ontology but a dissolution of ontology. We can attempt to phrase it like this: there is no real and no illusions because illusions presuppose real. All that remains is a pseudo-discussion with no foundation. From that vantage, we might even doubt the notion of illusions themselves. So zero-point solipsism might be so extreme as to devour the concept of illusions, ironically undoing the entire impetus for the position. We are left with no concept at all. In that sense, it is not so much a viewpoint as a conceptual black hole that swallows all viewpoints, including itself. Despite these complexities, the idea of zero-point solipsism can still be instructive. It highlights the fragility of the assumption that the presence of a thought or an experience implies an existing subject. Philosophically, it underscores that most talk of illusions or minds or realities relies on certain unexamined premises about vantage and existence. By pressing skepticism to its maximum, we see how precarious our frameworks might be. Even if we do not adopt zero-point solipsism as a lived worldview, the act of contemplating it reveals hidden assumptions in daily consciousness. For example, if we ordinarily assume I am here, the radical possibility that I am not here can force us to reflect on what being here actually means. That reflection, ironically, might deepen our appreciation for the standard vantage-based reality we typically inhabit, or it might open a path to a mystical or existential insight about the ephemeral nature of self. Perhaps it also fosters humility about the limits of reason, for once we stare into that abyss, we realize no argument can definitively rescue us from it, nor can any argument confirm it from inside. One might argue that zero-point solipsism, if it is coherent at all, is a purely negative position, a cancellation of all claims rather than an assertion of something else. Indeed, it might be best described not as a belief but as a radical refusal to believe anything, including the existence of a self or vantage. In that sense, it shares ground with certain forms of via negativa in theology or apophatic mysticism, which proceed by stripping away every concept or attribute, ending in a realm beyond speech. In those traditions, though, one often ends up with a sense of the divine as transcendent. Zero-point solipsism is typically not about a transcendent God or ground of being. It is about a radical emptiness so profound that it defies even the notion of emptiness. The difference might be subtle but is crucial. Mystical emptiness often implies a deeper fullness, while zero-point solipsism leaves no vantage for fullness or emptiness. That is why it can appear even more barren or more extreme than conventional mysticism. If we try to see how zero-point solipsism would address everyday concerns, we might be stumped. Suppose you wonder what to do about suffering, morality, relationships. If no vantage point exists, then moral frameworks or emotional attachments might also be illusions. Some might interpret this as a license for absolute amorality or an excuse to do anything. But from a zero-point stance, there is no one to do or not do, no vantage from which to choose. Illusions may swirl in a pattern that we call moral or immoral, but that swirl has no agent behind it. The illusions of empathy or cruelty may appear. The illusions of consequences may appear. None of these illusions belongs to anyone or stands on anything. So the question, what should I do, might not even arise meaningfully. If it does arise, that too is an illusion that disappears into the void. The swirling illusions might produce the appearance of making choices, but from the zero-point perspective, that is just more ephemeral phenomenon. This empties existence of the usual normative or purposeful dimension, raising the question of whether living from that vantage, again, ironically vantage, is even psychologically possible for human beings. Probably not, which is why zero-point solipsism is more an intellectual or metaphysical curiosity than a practical stance. We might also compare zero-point solipsism with simulation theories or illusions of the world theories from contemporary pop culture. For instance, some say we live in a simulated reality, but usually that still posits some vantage, either a mind inside the simulation or a mind outside it. Zero-point solipsism goes further, removing both the simulated and the simulator, the inside and the outside. Another parallel might be with the brain in a vat scenario, but again, That scenario typically posits a real brain somewhere being fed illusions. 0 point says there might be no real brain, no no illusions, no vantage. It is a giant, thorough meltdown of everything. Another angle is comparing it to the philosophical zombie discussion, where there might be behavior with no real consciousness. But that still implies some vantage or some illusions, whereas 0 point would say the entire scenario is vantageless. One might label 0 point solipsism as a bizarre form of meta-nihilism, overshadowing typical philosophical nihilism. Standard nihilism says, for instance, that there is no ultimate moral truth or that life lacks inherent meaning. 0 point solipsism counters that there is not even a vantage from which to declare anything about meaning or moral truths. In typical nihilism, you still have an existing subject adopting a stance. 0 point tears that subject away. It is not just the meaning that is absent. It is the existence of a someone who might lament or rejoice in that absence. The entire dimension of meaning and its observer dissolves. That is arguably the most extreme stance possible. Everything is illusions with no observer, no context, no anchor. A swirl of illusions in a void. Or not even illusions, since illusions imply a vantage. Perhaps an ineffable swirl of phenomena with no place in which to swirl, no vantage from which to swirl, no swirl at all. We are left with an immediate contradiction in terms. Throughout history, very few philosophers have wholeheartedly endorsed anything like 0 point solipsism. Those who glimpse it typically come away with the conclusion that reason breaks down in the face of it, or that it is a worthless stance for practical living. Some might see it as akin to a momentary phenomenon in deep meditative or trance states, where the sense of I am vanishes. If one goes deeper, even the sense of conscious presence might vanish, leaving a blank. But once one returns from that state, one is presumably back to a vantage, concluding something just happened. 0 point solipsism would say that vantage is also an illusion. So, ironically, if you truly abide in 0 point solipsism, there might be no recognition that anything happened or that any vantage was lost or gained. Such a domain is outside the realm of rational or empirical discourse, and that is precisely why it is so confounding. We might also see 0 point solipsism as an extreme kind of philosophical art, a conceptual meltdown that tests the boundaries of language. It is reminiscent of how certain avant-garde artists create pieces that challenge the definition of art or the relationship between artist and audience. 0 point solipsism similarly challenges the definition of a philosophical stance. Typically, a stance is something a subject can adopt. But here, the subject is gone. So can it even be adopted or proposed? If illusions of writing or reading appear, that is an ephemeral swirl. If illusions of comprehending or rejecting appear, ephemeral swirl. None of that swirl belongs to anyone. Possibly, the swirl includes this entire 20,000-word piece, read by illusions of readers, typed by illusions of authors. The swirl is unbounded by time, for time also might be illusions with no vantage. Indeed, 0 point solipsism implies that any notion of continuity, memory, or progression is ephemeral. That thoroughly dismantles the usual sense of cause and effect, because cause and effect typically require vantage points to track or measure changes over time. If illusions do appear to revolve in a cause and effect manner, that is still part of the swirl, but from the 0 point stance, it is meaningless to say it is really happening. One might wonder if 0 point solipsism tangentially touches certain lines of theoretical physics, like the notion that the wave function of the universe is a timeless entity in some interpretations of quantum cosmology, or that all events exist in a block universe. But those ideas still typically posit a real wave function or a real block, so they do not fully align with 0 point. 0 point would say not even the wave function or the block is real. They are illusions from no vantage. Another attempt might be to link it to emergent illusions in a purely mathematical sense, but that still presupposes a vantage of mathematics or logicians. 0 point defies that. Indeed, it defies all attempts to house it in a system, because every system has vantage-based presuppositions. Hence, it remains purely negative, purely destructive of conceptual frameworks. A curious dimension arises if we attempt to refute 0 point solipsism. Any refutation would take the form, but we can demonstrate that the subject must exist because, Or look at these experiences, they prove a vantage. 0 Point immediately counters that the vantage you speak of is itself an illusion. The demonstration is also illusions. There is no vantage to be convinced or unconvinced. That retort might feel like cheating or an unassailable rhetorical trick. Indeed, 0 Point solipsism can be described as an unstoppable negative force. It cannot be pinned down or argued out of existence because it denies the existence of the arguer. But the same unstoppable negativity is also unprovable because it denies vantage from which proof could emerge. So it is a black hole for rational debate, a stance that reveals the precarious structure of rational discourse. One might see it as the ultimate mind f***k in philosophical speculation, precisely because it topples even the final bulwark of the I. Some might say, surely something must exist. Even illusions must occur as illusions in something. 0 Point solipsism retorts, that is your assumption. You do not know that illusions need a container. Why can illusions not swirl in a vantageless void, or swirl in no void at all? You are imposing the vantage-based logic that illusions require an observer or container, but that logic is a vantage-based artifact. We are left with an argument that illusions might spontaneously be, but not for or in anything. Then one might reply, but illusions being might itself be an illusion. Precisely so. We chase ourselves in circles. This recursive meltdown is the hallmark of 0 Point. It is not just extreme skepticism about the external world or about knowledge. It is a direct assault on the fundamental subject-object framework that underpins cognition. Some mystics, as noted, have described states that echo aspects of this meltdown, but usually with the twist of discovering a deeper reality or a cosmic unity. 0 Point denies even that deeper unity. So it may represent the limit case of mystical or philosophical emptiness, absent any consoling cosmic consciousness. One might suppose that 0 Point solipsism is intellectually interesting but emotionally or spiritually bankrupt. A path to nowhere that can offer no guidance or solace. That might well be true from a vantage of seeking meaning. But ironically, from 0 Point, there is no vantage, so the question of meaning is moot. In practical life, illusions presumably continue to function as though a vantage existed. This is reminiscent of the old idea that if we have illusions, we act on them anyway. For instance, if illusions of hunger appear, illusions of seeking food might follow. There is no you who does that, but the swirl of illusions plays out. In that sense, 0 Point solipsism might not change anything in daily life. The illusions keep spinning. That might be the way out for those who find it horrifying. You cannot practically adopt or realize 0 Point solipsism in everyday behavior. The swirl remains the swirl, vantage or not. The illusions of caring, working, or relating might still surface. The illusions of reading or forgetting might continue. And at no time is there a vantage that truly steps outside them. The biggest takeaway from 0 Point solipsism, ironically, may be its capacity to highlight the inherent vantage-based nature of nearly all philosophical or scientific positions. It is as if 0 Point stands outside the entire playing field, pointing out that every move on the field presupposes a vantage to be in the game. By stating that vantage itself is an illusion, 0 Point effectively says the game is baseless. Some might say that indicates the theory is nonsense. Others might say it is a negative mirror, revealing the game's hidden scaffolding by refusing it entirely. Whether that yields some kind of insight is debatable, because 0 Point might not lead to a new positive statement about reality. It is just an evisceration of vantage. That might be an insight only in the sense that it shows how every attempt at constructing a worldview depends on unprovable vantage assumptions. Another domain we can mention is logic and mathematics. Typically, logic assumes there are statements, there is a system, and that we can evaluate truth values from a vantage. 0 Point solipsism might ask, who is evaluating? Under what vantage do these logical statements exist? If all is swirl with no vantage, can logic even happen? If illusions of logic appear, so be it, but they belong to no one and are grounded in nothing. That is not typical logic or even par-consistent logic. It is vantageless illusions that we label logic. The entire enterprise is ephemeral. This suggests that 0 stands beyond rational or irrational. It is non-rational in the sense that it denies vantage for rational consistency or for contradiction. Indeed, it might even deny the vantage for denial. We see how the stance short-circuits not just knowledge but the frameworks that let us talk about knowledge. One might suspect that we are simply playing with words. That is likely correct, in the sense that 0 solipsism cannot truly be lived or expressed directly. It is more of a limit case or conceptual meltdown. But limit cases can be philosophically fruitful, exposing the boundaries of what is thinkable. If we ask, what if the boundary itself is an illusion? We approach something like 0. Some might find it akin to a highly destructive or apophatic approach that negates everything. Even apophatic theology typically stops short of negating vantage altogether. Here we push the negation to the absolute limit. It is apophasis about everything, including the negator. That is what sets 0 solipsism apart. We could explore how one might come to believe or discover 0 solipsism. Perhaps it starts with normal skepticism. We doubt external objects, then we doubt other minds, then we doubt the existence of a body or a brain. Finally, we come to I cannot doubt the doubter. But 0 takes one more step. What if the doubter is also an illusion? Instead of the cogito being a bedrock of certainty, it becomes a mere ephemeral swirl that cannot anchor anything. We realize that the immediate sense of I am might be a phenomenon that arises and passes, with no deeper root. If we follow that doubt rigorously, we end up with 0. Or at least the illusions of such an end might appear in the swirl. Given the difficulty or impossibility of expressing 0 solipsism in consistent language, we might guess that many philosophers never spelled it out. Instead, they might have glimpsed it as a nightmare scenario or an unspeakable step. Indeed, some authors in mystical or existential traditions have described states that feel like the absolute void, though typically they come back from that experience describing some residue that they interpret as God, being, or pure consciousness. 0 rejects that residue as well, leaving absolutely nothing. Some traditions in negative theology approach that, but they often slip into statements about God being beyond being. That still implies something. 0 has no vantage from which to say beyond being. Everything is undone, vantage included. In modern parlance, we might also see 0 solipsism invoked ironically on internet forums, with statements like, maybe you do not even exist to yourself, or I can't prove that the sense of me is real. Usually these are jokes or fleeting remarks that do not investigate the concept's depth. But behind them lies a genuine philosophical bombshell. If we let it detonate fully, we face a thorough dissolution of subjectivity, objectivity, illusions, and reality. What is left is an impossible state, impossible in vantage-based logic, where illusions presumably swirl for no one, or possibly do not swirl at all. The notion of swirling might also be vantage-based. We run out of language, and that is the entire point. As we near the end of this exploration, we might ask, has anything of substance been conveyed? If 0 solipsism undermines vantage, do these 20,000 words mean anything? The 0 stance might say, no, they do not mean anything. They are illusions read by illusions in a swirl of illusions, belonging to no vantage. Some might find that deeply unsatisfying. Another perspective might say that, ironically, illusions can still have local coherence within the swirl. The illusions of reading might yield illusions of insight or confusion. None of it is real, yet it can appear to function. So from a vantage-based perspective, which we slip into out of necessity, we might glean a sense of the meltdown 0 offers, even though in the swirl itself no vantage gleaned anything. The swirl just is or is not. The final rung of logic collapses, so we hold on to language, ironically, while acknowledging that the position denies any vantage for the user of language. In a final attempt at summarizing the gist of 0 solipsism, we might say, the entire idea that I exist, that illusions exist for me, that the external world might be illusory, is replaced by an even more radical suspicion. There is no I, no illusions, no vantage point. The normal categories of existence and illusion do not apply at all. This breaks the usual solipsism of only my mind is real by discarding the mind as well. We might label it 0 point to emphasize that we do not even have a single point of reference, a single vantage from which to claim existence or illusions. If illusions appear to swirl, they do so for no one, in no medium, for no reason, lacking time, lacking space, lacking substance. One might then say that is effectively the same as nothing existing. But the phrase nothing exists might be vantage-based, implying we have a vantage to declare it. 0 point even undermines that. We are left with no vantage to say it or to hear it. This is the conceptual black hole at the end of the line. Some readers might attempt to glean a mystical or cosmic resonance from all this. Perhaps it resonates with absolute emptiness or some ineffable dimension. But 0 point solipsism is not exactly a dimension or realm. It is the denial of vantage, reality, illusions, or any dimension. So if it resonates with mystical emptiness, we must note that many mystical traditions at least preserve a vantage to talk about emptiness. 0 point does not. One might then surmise that it is the apex or nadir of all possible philosophical or spiritual inquiry, the final meltdown, leaving no vantage for further seeking. If that is the case, the illusions we call this essay might have served to highlight that meltdown, only to dissolve themselves in the end. No vantage remains to interpret them. In the swirling illusions that pass as everyday life, of course, we typically revert to vantage-based interactions. We treat ourselves as real persons, treat logic as valid, treat illusions as illusions we might correct. 0 point might appear fleetingly as a mind f***k concept, only to recede behind the momentum of normal existence. But in a purely conceptual sense, once glimpsed, it can never be entirely unglimpsed. It stands as a theoretical possibility that everything, including the vantage calling it a possibility, might not exist, might never have existed. The swirl of illusions includes the illusions of the swirl itself. That is 0 point solipsism in all its self-devouring totality. If a concluding statement is even possible, it might be this: 0 point solipsism is the ultimate radical skepticism that calls into question not only the external world but the very existence of the subject that doubts. It is not simply I alone exist. It is there is no I, no existence, no vantage. This stance, if it can be called a stance, annihilates the final shred of certainty that standard solipsism maintains, leaving behind a domain beyond illusions or no domain at all. From the vantage of vantage-based thought, it is an absurd meltdown. From 0 point's own perspective, which does not exist, there is no statement to make, no illusions to sustain it, no reality to quell it. It is the absolute dissolution of vantage, self, and world alike. Whether that is an intelligible concept, a living reality, or a meaningless cascade of words is itself part of the illusion swirling in no vantage. Or so it would say if it could speak, but it cannot. Yet here we are, reading or writing illusions in a swirl that belongs to no vantage. And that, ironically, may be the closest we come to articulating the inarticulable heart of 0 point solipsism.